He had everything: power, money, respect. But he didn't know what warmth felt like. She had nothing, just a baby in her arms and a heartbreaking request. "May I have a plate of food?" He thought nothing could surprise him, until he looked into her eyes. That night in a modest restaurant, destiny took its first step, because sometimes true love doesn't begin with promises. It begins with hunger, silence, and a single look that changes everything. The rain hammered against the windows of Miller's diner like an insistent visitor demanding entry. Outside, the neon sign flickered weakly, casting intermittent red shadows across the wet pavement of this modest neighborhood corner. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and home-cooked meals mingled with the soft murmur of conversations from the few remaining customers. Alexander Blackwood sat alone at table 7, his charcoal suit incongruous among the checkered tablecloths and vinyl booths. At 37, he possessed the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms: 6 feet 2 inches of controlled power, with shoulders that spoke of discipline and a jawline that could cut glass. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the weather, and his steel-gray eyes held the kind of intensity that made shareholders either very nervous or very wealthy. He shouldn't have been there. The owner of Blackwood Banking Corporation, the largest financial network in the country, had no business sitting in a neighborhood diner at 9:30 on a Tuesday evening, but after 14 hours in his glass tower, surrounded by reports and projections that painted his success in cold numbers, something had driven him from his penthouse office into the anonymous night. Alexander pushed the untouched meatloaf around his plate, his appetite as absent as his motivation to return to his empty mansion. The silence of his life had become deafening lately, a fact he acknowledged with the same clinical detachment he applied to market analyses. At 37, he had built an empire his controlling father would have envied, yet sitting in this humble diner, he felt more isolated than ever. The soft shuffle of footsteps barely registered until a shadow fell across his table. When he looked up, his world shifted on its axis. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. She stood there trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper: desperation, carefully held in check. 22 years old, with honey-brown hair that caught the diner's warm light and eyes the color of autumn leaves, she clutched a sleeping infant against her chest. The baby, maybe a year old, wore a pink onesie that had seen better days but was spotlessly clean. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the diner's ambient noise with startling clarity. "I'm sorry to bother you, but—" She swallowed hard, and Alexander watched the struggle play across her delicate features. Could I eat your leftovers, please?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In boardrooms, he'd seen grown men crumble under pressure, witnessed corporations fall with less impact than those quietly spoken words. He'd been raised by a father who viewed emotions as weakness, trained himself to remain unmoved by sob stories and manipulation tactics. But something about her dignity in the face of desperation shattered every defense he'd spent decades building. Emily Carter had rehearsed this moment for 20 minutes in the diner's parking lot, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the well-dressed man through the rain-streaked window. She'd told herself it was just pride she'd have to swallow, just one moment of humiliation, to ensure little Grace had something in her stomach tonight. But now, standing before this imposing stranger, she felt her carefully constructed composure threatening to crumble. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that made her acutely aware of her worn jeans and the milk stain on her sweater. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his perfectly tailored suit to the expensive watch glinting on his wrist. She'd probably chosen the worst possible person to approach, but Grace had been fussing for hours, and the last of their groceries had run out yesterday. "Please," she added when he didn't respond immediately, misreading his stunned silence for rejection. "I have money for a glass of milk for my sister, but not enough for—" "Sister?" Alexander's voice came out rougher than intended. He was 37 years old, had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, yet this young woman's simple request had left him speechless. Emily nodded, unconsciously tightening her protective hold on Grace. "She's 14 months old. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. I just thought Maybe if you weren't going to finish. Alexander's eyes took in the details his business instincts automatically catalogued, the careful way she held the child, the worn but clean clothes, the way her chin lifted slightly despite her obvious embarrassment. She wasn't a con artist or a professional beggar. She was simply a young woman who'd run out of options. "Sit down," he said, his authoritative tone making her blink in surprise. When she hesitated, he gentled his voice. "Please, both of you, sit down." Emily remained standing, uncertainty flickering across her features. "I didn't mean to impose. If you could just—" "Miss." Alexander rose from his seat, his full height making her tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition neither could have named. "When was the last time you ate a proper meal?" The question caught her off guard, and her automatic deflection died on her lips as she looked into his grey eyes. Instead of the pity or judgment she'd expected, she found something that looked almost like concern. "I eat," she said quietly, which wasn't technically a lie. She did eat, crackers, whatever leftovers she could find, the occasional apple when Grace needed her formula money stretched. Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "That's not what I asked." He pulled out the chair across from him. "Please, let me buy you dinner, both of you." "I couldn't accept—" "You could," he interrupted, then caught himself. In business, he commanded. Here, he realized, he needed to request. "Would you? Please?" Emily stared at him, searching for the catch, the ulterior motive her experience with men had taught her to expect. But his eyes held only sincerity, and Grace chose that moment to stir in her arms, making a soft sound that tugged at Emily's heart. Slowly, carefully, she sat down, and neither of them realized that with that simple gesture, everything in their carefully ordered worlds had just begun to change. The worn vinyl booth creaked softly as Emily settled into the seat, Grace still nestled against her chest. The baby stirred, dark lashes fluttering against chubby cheeks, but remained peacefully asleep. Emily found herself studying the man across from her, noting how his intimidating business persona seemed to soften slightly now that they were seated at the same level. Alexander caught the attention of their waitress, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, who'd been watching the interaction with curious eyes. "Could we get 2 complete dinners, please? The meatloaf special, and—" He looked at Emily. "What would you prefer?" "Oh, I couldn't," Emily started, but Alexander raised a hand, his expression gentle but firm. "You came here hungry. I'm offering food. It's that simple." His grey eyes held hers steadily. "What sounds good to you?" Emily's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she felt heat creep up her neck. The chicken parmesan looked nice," she admitted quietly. "Chicken parmesan for the lady, meatloaf for me, and could we get some warm milk for the little one? In a bottle if you have one." Alexander's request to Ruth was polite, but carried an undertone of authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his requests fulfilled without question. Ruth nodded approvingly. "Coming right up, honey. And don't you worry about that sweet baby. I've got 5 grandchildren of my own." She bustled away, leaving Emily staring at the man who'd just ordered dinner for her family, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't even know our names," Emily said softly, her fingers automatically stroking Grace's back in soothing circles. Alexander realized she was right, and the oversight struck him as oddly significant. In his world, names were always exchanged first, titles, credentials, net worth assessments following close behind. "You're right. I'm Alexander Blackwood." He paused, watching her face for recognition that didn't come. Somehow that pleased him more than it should have. "Emily Carter," she replied. "And this is Grace." "Grace," Alexander repeated, his voice unconsciously softening as he looked at the sleeping child. "She's beautiful. She has your eyes." Emily's hand stilled on Grace's back. "She's actually my sister, not my daughter, though I suppose the distinction doesn't matter much anymore." There was a weight to her words that made Alexander lean forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Emily was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but he could hear the carefully controlled emotion underneath. "Our mother died 4 months ago. Cancer. Grace was born when I was 21, so I'm all she has now." The simple statement hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd lost his mother when he was 12, but he'd had resources, boarding schools, trust funds. This young woman was facing the responsibility of raising a child with nothing but determination and love. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. "That must be overwhelming." Emily managed a small smile. "Some days are harder than others, but she's worth it. She's always worth it." She looked down at Grace, and Alexander saw something transform in her expression, a fierce protectiveness combined with tender devotion that made his chest tight. Ruth returned with their drinks and the promised bottle of warm milk. "Food'll be right out," she announced cheerfully. "That little angel wake up hungry, you just let me know." As if summoned by the mention of food, Grace's eyes opened, revealing the same warm brown as her sister's. She blinked owlishly at her unfamiliar surroundings before focusing on Alexander. Instead of the crying he'd expected, she simply stared at him with that intense, unblinking gaze that only small children could manage. "Hello there," Alexander said softly, and Grace rewarded him with a drooly smile that did something unprecedented to his cardiovascular system. Emily watched the exchange with growing amazement. Grace was typically shy around strangers, especially men, but she seemed completely comfortable with this intimidating businessman. "She likes you," Emily observed. "That's unusual." "Is it?" Alexander found himself leaning closer, absurdly pleased by the infant's acceptance. "Hello, Grace. Are you hungry?" Grace babbled something unintelligible and reached a chubby hand toward him. Without thinking, Alexander offered his finger, which she grasped with surprising strength. The simple contact sent an unexpected warmth shooting through him. "She's got quite a grip," he murmured, then looked up to find Emily watching him with an unreadable expression. "What?" "Most people in suits like yours don't voluntarily let babies grab them," Emily said quietly. "Designer fabric and drool don't usually mix." Alexander glanced down at his $1,000 suit, then back at Grace, who was now attempting to bring his finger to her mouth. "It's just a suit," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Emily felt something shift in her chest as she watched this powerful, obviously wealthy man patiently allow her baby sister to gum his finger. Every man she'd ever known had seen Grace as an inconvenience at best, a deal-breaker at worst. Her ex-boyfriend had actually suggested she find someone else to take care of the situation when her mother's illness worsened. But this stranger, this intimidating businessman who could probably buy and sell half the city, was speaking to Grace in soft tones and didn't seem to care that she was now slobbering on his expensive watch. Their food arrived, and Alexander gently extracted his finger from Grace's grasp to help Emily position the high chair Ruth had thoughtfully brought over. As Emily settled Grace into the chair, Alexander found himself studying the graceful efficiency of her movements, the way she automatically checked the chair's safety features, the gentle murmur of reassurance she offered the baby. "You're a natural at this," he observed, as Emily successfully got Grace interested in the bottle. "Trial by fire," Emily replied with a wry smile. "Grace was only 10 months old when Mom died. I had to learn fast." "What about your job? Childcare must be expensive." Emily's face clouded. "I was working at a local preschool, but they let me go last month. Too many absences when Grace was sick or when I couldn't find a babysitter." She took a careful bite of her chicken parmesan, and Alexander saw her close her eyes briefly in appreciation. "This is incredible," she murmured. "When did you last have a hot meal?" Alexander asked, then held up a hand when she started to protest. "I'm not judging. I'm asking." Emily considered lying, then decided this stranger's opinion couldn't hurt her any more than the truth. "Last week, maybe?" A neighbor brought over casserole when she heard Grace crying. She looked embarrassed. "I've been selling homemade cookies at the farmer's market on weekends, but it's not exactly steady income." Alexander felt something he couldn't name burning in his chest. Anger, maybe, at a system that could let someone like this fall through the cracks. Or perhaps something more personal, a fierce protectiveness that had no rational basis, but felt as real as his heartbeat. "Where are you staying now?" he asked carefully. Emily's hand tightened around her fork. "We're managing," she said, which Alexander correctly interpreted as nowhere good. They ate in relative silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Grace babbled happily in her high chair, occasionally offering drooly smiles to Alexander, who found himself completely charmed. Emily ate slowly, savoring every bite, and Alexander realized he was getting more pleasure from watching her enjoy the meal than he'd gotten from food in months. As Ruth cleared their plates, Alexander made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors and probably given his father a heart attack. But sitting across from Emily and Grace, watching the love and devotion that radiated from this young woman despite her circumstances, he knew there was only one thing he could do. "Emily," he said quietly, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that reminded him he was still human after all. "I have a proposition for you." Emily's fork froze halfway to her mouth at Alexander's words. In her experience, propositions from wealthy men rarely ended well for young women in her situation. She set down her utensil carefully, unconsciously shifting closer to Grace's high chair. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, her voice steady despite the way her pulse quickened. Alexander noticed her defensive posture and felt a stab of something that might have been hurt. Of course she'd be suspicious. A strange man offering help always came with strings attached in her world. He leaned back slightly, trying to appear less imposing. "I own several properties around the city," he began, choosing his words carefully. "One of them, a 2-bedroom apartment in Maple Heights, has been vacant for months. Good neighborhood, safe building, close to parks and schools." Emily's eyebrows drew together. "I don't understand what that has to do with—" "You and Grace need somewhere to stay," Alexander continued, his grey eyes never leaving hers. "The apartment is just sitting there, costing me money in utilities and maintenance anyway. It seems practical to have someone living there." The word practical hung in the air between them. Emily stared at him, searching his face for the catch she knew had to be coming. Men like Alexander Blackwood didn't offer free apartments to women they'd just met without expecting something in return. "What would you want in exchange?" she asked bluntly. Alexander blinked, momentarily thrown by her directness. "Nothing, There's always something," Emily interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "Nobody gives away free housing without expecting something back. So what is it? Cleaning? Cooking? Or something else?" The implication in her voice made Alexander's jaw tighten. He'd encountered enough gold diggers and opportunists in his life to recognize the assumption, but coming from Emily, it stung more than it should have. "Nothing like that," he said, his voice taking on the clipped tone he used in business negotiations. "It's a matter of security, that's all. A young woman alone with an infant shouldn't be—" He gestured vaguely, then met her eyes directly. "You asked me for leftovers, Emily. That tells me you're not in a position to be choosy about living arrangements." Emily flinched as if he'd slapped her. The truth of his words made her cheeks burn with humiliation, but it also sparked the stubborn pride that had gotten her through the worst months of her life. "You're right," she said quietly, lifting her chin. "I'm not in a position to be choosy, but I'm also not desperate enough to put myself or Grace in a dangerous situation. I don't know you, Mr. Blackwood. For all I know, this generous offer is just a way to get us somewhere isolated where—" "Where what?" Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. "You think I'm some kind of predator?" Grace, sensing the sudden tension, began to fuss in her high chair. Emily immediately turned her attention to the baby, lifting her and settling her against her shoulder with practiced ease. The movement was instinctive, protective, and it made Alexander's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "I think you're a stranger who appeared out of nowhere and is offering something that sounds too good to be true," Emily said, her voice muffled against Grace's hair. "In my experience, things like that usually are." Alexander watched her soothe the baby with gentle pats and soft murmurs and felt his irritation drain away. She was right to be cautious. If she'd been his sister, if he'd had a sister, he would have wanted her to be exactly this suspicious of strange men bearing gifts. "You're smart to be careful," he admitted, his voice gentling. "But I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. The building has a doorman, security cameras, other tenants. You could visit during the day, meet the neighbors, check the locks. Hell, you could have the police run a background check on me if it would make you feel safer." Emily looked up at him, surprised by his reasonable response. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this for strangers?" It was the question Alexander had been asking himself since the words left his mouth. Why was he offering his apartment to a woman he'd met 20 minutes ago? Why did the thought of her and Grace sleeping in some unsafe place make his stomach clench with worry? He looked at Grace, who had settled down and was now peering at him over Emily's shoulder with those big brown eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. "Because Grace reminds me of someone I used to know," he said quietly. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. "And because—" he met Emily's eyes. "Because I have more than I need, and you clearly don't have enough. It's that simple." Emily studied his face for a long moment, looking for deception and finding only sincerity. Grace babbled softly and reached toward Alexander again, her tiny fingers opening and closing in the universal baby gesture for pick-me-up. "She really does like you," Emily murmured, almost to herself. "The feeling is mutual," Alexander replied, and meant it. He'd never paid much attention to children. They existed on the periphery of his world, like so many other things he didn't have time for. But Grace, with her drooly smiles and trusting eyes, had somehow bypassed every defense mechanism he'd spent years perfecting. Emily was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think she was formulating a polite rejection. Then Grace chose that moment to spit up on Emily's shoulder, and the young woman's face crumpled with exhaustion and embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, grabbing napkins to clean up the mess. "She's not usually. She's been fussier lately because we've been staying at—" She stopped herself, but not before Alexander caught the implication. "Where have you been staying, Emily?" he asked gently. Her shoulders sagged with defeat. "The shelter downtown has a 3-night limit. We've been rotating between there and a women's center across town, but there's a waiting list, and when it's full we sleep in my car." The words came out in a rush, as if she couldn't bear to say them slowly. Alexander felt something cold and furious unfurl in his chest. The image of Emily and Grace spending nights in a car while he rattled around his empty mansion made him physically ill. "That's not acceptable," he said, his voice harder than he intended. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "It's what we have. Not everyone can afford—" "That's not what I meant." Alexander held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "I meant it's not acceptable that the city's resources are so limited that families like yours end up on the street. You shouldn't have to make that choice." Emily blinked at him, thrown off balance by his clarification. She'd grown used to people judging her situation, offering platitudes about pulling herself up by her bootstraps. She hadn't expected understanding. "The apartment," Alexander continued, "has furniture, utilities, everything you need. There's no lease to sign, no deposit required, just—" He paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate. "Just let me help, please." "I can't pay rent," Emily said quietly. "I won't lie to you about that. I can barely afford groceries." "I'm not asking for rent." "Then what happens when you decide you want us gone, when this charitable impulse wears off?" Her voice was steady, but Alexander could see the fear underneath. "Grace needs stability, not temporary kindness from a stranger who might change his mind." Alexander leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. "I give you my word that won't happen. And if it helps, we can put it in writing. 6 months minimum, no questions asked. That should give you time to find work, save money, figure out your next step." Emily looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, tiny fist curled against Emily's collarbone. The baby's peaceful face held complete trust that Emily would take care of her, would make the right decisions, would somehow find a way to give her the safe, stable life she deserved. "Why 6 months?" Emily asked finally. Alexander shrugged, trying to look casual despite the way his heart was hammering. "Seemed reasonable. Long enough to be useful, short enough that you don't feel trapped." It was a lie. 6 months felt like nothing, and forever all at once. But he couldn't very well tell her that the thought of her disappearing from his life after tonight made him panic in ways he didn't understand. "I need to think about it," Emily said eventually. "Of course." Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "That's my direct number. Call me tomorrow if you're interested, and we can arrange for you to see the place." Emily took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. The contact was electric, sending an unexpected jolt up her arm that made her breath catch. From the way Alexander's eyes widened slightly, she wasn't the only one who felt it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For dinner, for the offer, for—" She gestured helplessly. "For treating you like a human being instead of a charity case," Alexander supplied gently. Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. As they prepared to leave, Alexander insisted on calling a cab for them despite Emily's protests. While they waited, Grace woke up and began fussing again. Without thinking, Alexander reached for her. "May I?" he asked. Emily hesitated for just a moment before transferring the baby to his arms. Alexander held Grace carefully, as if she were made of spun glass, and began swaying gently from side to side. To Emily's amazement, Grace settled immediately, her tiny hand curling around Alexander's tie. "You're a natural," Emily observed softly. "Beginner's luck," Alexander replied, but he was smiling down at Grace with an expression that made Emily's chest tight. When the cab arrived, Alexander helped them into the back seat and handed the driver a $50 bill. "Take them wherever they need to go," he instructed, his voice carrying that undertone of authority that brooked no argument. As the cab pulled away, Emily looked back through the rear window to see Alexander standing under the diner's flickering neon sign, hands in his pockets, watching until they disappeared into the night. She looked down at the business card in her hand, studying the elegant script. Alexander Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Banking Corporation. Below that, in his own handwriting, "Call me." For the first time in months, Emily felt something that might have been hope. Emily sat in the Women's Center common room at 6 in the morning, Grace sleeping fitfully in the portable crib beside her. The business card had been turned over so many times the edges were soft, but she still couldn't bring herself to pick up the phone. Around her, other women were beginning to stir, single mothers like herself, elderly women who'd fallen through society's cracks, teenagers who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere else to go. Emily had learned their stories over the past weeks, had seen the defeated look that crept into their eyes after months or years of broken promises from well-meaning strangers. "That man still on your mind?" Emily looked up to find Mrs. Rodriguez settling into the chair beside her. The 60-year-old woman had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Grace over the past few weeks, often watching the baby when Emily went on job interviews that never seemed to pan out. "Is it that obvious?" Emily asked with a tired smile. "Honey, you've been staring at that card like it might bite you for 3 days straight. Whatever's on it must be either very good or very bad news." Emily sighed, running her thumb over Alexander's handwritten note. "Too good, I think." "Which usually means it's too good to be true." Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands folding in her lap. "You know, I've been in and out of places like this for 2 years now. Started when my husband died, and I couldn't keep up with the mortgage." She glanced at Emily. "I've seen a lot of people come through here, and I've learned to spot the difference between someone who's down on their luck and someone who's given up hope." "Which one am I?" Emily asked softly. "You're still fighting, Mika, still trying to build something better for that baby girl, but you're scared to trust, and I can't blame you for that." Mrs. Rodriguez reached over and patted Emily's hand. "Sometimes, though, you have to take a leap of faith. Not because you're sure it'll work out, but because the alternative is standing still." Grace stirred in her crib, making soft, waking up sounds. Emily reached for her automatically, settling the baby against her chest as she considered Mrs. Rodriguez's words. "What if it's a mistake?" Emily whispered. "What if it's not?" An hour later, Emily found herself standing outside the Maple Heights apartment building with Grace in her arms, staring up at the elegant brick facade. Alexander had given her the address along with his phone number, suggesting she take a look at the neighborhood before making her decision. The building was beautiful, classical architecture with modern security features, well-maintained landscaping, and a uniformed doorman who smiled kindly at Grace when they approached. It was the kind of place Emily had walked past 100 times, never dreaming she might actually live somewhere so nice. "You must be Miss Carter," the doorman said, checking his tablet. "Mr. Blackwood said you might be stopping by. I'm James. Would you like me to show you around?" Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. Everything about this felt surreal, like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The apartment was on the 4th floor, facing a small park where children played under their mother's watchful eyes. James unlocked the door and gestured for her to enter first. Emily stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The space was beautiful, hardwood floors gleaming in the morning sunlight, tall windows with gauzy white curtains, furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. The living room flowed into an open kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and through an archway she could see a dining room with a table that could seat 6. "The master bedroom is this way," James said, leading her down a short hallway. and this would be perfect for the little miss. The second bedroom had been set up as a nursery. Emily's steps slowed as she took in the white crib with its mobile of dancing butterflies, the changing table stocked with diapers and supplies, the rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. "Mr. Blackwood had this done yesterday," James explained, watching Emily's stunned expression. "Said he wanted to make sure everything was ready if you decided to stay." Emily sank into the rocking chair, Grace babbling happily in her arms as she reached for the mobile's colourful butterflies. The room smelled of fresh paint and new furniture, and Emily realized she was crying. "Miss Carter, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Emily managed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's just, no one's ever done anything like this for us before." James smiled gently. "Mr. Blackwood is a good man. Bit intense sometimes, but he's got a good heart. You and your daughter will be safe here." "Sister," Emily corrected automatically. "Grace is my sister." "Sister then. Point stands." James handed her a set of keys. "These are yours if you want them. No pressure, no timeline. Mr. Blackwood just wanted you to know you had options." Emily looked around the nursery again, taking in every carefully chosen detail. The mobile, the soft yellow paint, the bookshelf already filled with board books and stuffed animals. Someone, Alexander, had thought about what a baby would need, what would make her comfortable and happy. Grace chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, clapping her hands at the dancing butterflies. The sound of pure joy echoed through the room, and Emily felt something inside her chest unfurl for the first time in months. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number on Alexander's business card. "Blackwood." His voice was crisp, professional, but Emily could hear the underlying tension that suggested he'd been waiting for her call. "Mr. Blackwood, it's Emily Carter." She heard him exhale slowly. "Emily, have you had a chance to see the apartment?" "I'm here now," Emily said, watching Grace try to grab the mobile. It's beautiful. Too beautiful. I don't understand why you're doing this." "Because I can," Alexander said simply, "and because you need it." Sometimes it really is that straightforward. Emily was quiet for a moment, struggling with words. "The nursery? You didn't have to—" Grace needed somewhere to sleep. It seemed practical to make sure she was comfortable. That word again. Practical. But there was nothing practical about the expensive crib, the carefully chosen books, the mobile that probably cost more than Emily made in a week. This was kindness, pure and simple, and Emily didn't know how to process it. "Mr. Blackwood. Alexander," he corrected gently. "If you're going to be living in my apartment, I think we can move past formalities." "Alexander," Emily repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "I need you to understand something. I won't be anyone's kept woman. I won't owe you anything beyond what any decent tenant would owe a landlord, and the moment this arrangement becomes something else, Grace and I are gone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Alexander spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "What kind of arrangement do you think I'm proposing?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "That's what scares me." "Emily." Alexander's voice gentled, and she could almost picture him in some expensive office, loosening his tie as he searched for the right words. "I'm not looking for anything from you except the peace of mind that comes from knowing you and Grace are safe. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less." Emily closed her eyes, Grace's weight warm and solid in her arms. Every instinct she'd developed over the past few months screamed at her to run, to stick with the devil she knew rather than trusting this unexpected angel. But then Grace laughed again, reaching for the butterflies with pure, uncomplicated joy, and Emily realized that sometimes love meant taking risks. Sometimes it meant accepting help, even when pride demanded otherwise. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. We'll take it. The apartment. For 6 months, like you said." Emily's voice grew stronger. "But I want everything in writing. Lease terms, expectations, everything. And I pay utilities." "Emily, you don't need to—" "I pay utilities," she repeated firmly. "And groceries. I won't be completely dependent on your charity." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "All right. Utilities and groceries. I'll have my lawyer draw up a lease agreement this afternoon." "Thank you," Emily said quietly. "I know you don't understand why this is so important to me, but—" "I do understand," Alexander interrupted. "You're protecting your independence and your sister's future. It's exactly what you should do." After they hung up, Emily sat in the rocking chair for a long time, letting the morning sunlight wash over her and Grace as the baby played with her new mobile. For the first time since her mother's death, Emily allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next meal, the next night's shelter, the next crisis to navigate. It was a dangerous luxury hope, but as Grace babbled happily in her arms, surrounded by evidence of a stranger's inexplicable kindness, Emily thought maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. That afternoon, a courier arrived at the Women's Center with a complete lease agreement, a welcome basket filled with groceries and baby supplies, and a note written in Alexander's precise handwriting. "Welcome home. A." Emily read the note 3 times before tucking it carefully into Grace's diaper bag. Home. It had been so long since that word meant anything more than wherever they happened to be sleeping that night. So as she packed their meager belongings, Emily found herself wondering about Alexander Blackwood, what had motivated him to help strangers, what his life was like in that expensive suit and polished shoes, whether she'd ever see him again now that the practical arrangements were settled. She told herself it didn't matter. This was about Grace, about stability, about building a foundation for their future. Whatever complicated feelings she might be developing about their mysterious benefactor were irrelevant. But as she carried Grace toward their new home, Emily couldn't shake the memory of Alexander's gentle hands holding her sister, or the way his entire demeanor had softened when Grace smiled at him. Some things she was beginning to realize were more complicated than they seemed. 3 weeks into their new life at Maple Heights, Emily had almost convinced herself that Alexander Blackwood had been a beautiful dream. The lease agreement was real. The apartment was real. The safety and comfort were gloriously real. But the man himself had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. Emily told herself she was grateful for his absence. It made the arrangement feel more legitimate, less like charity with strings attached. But as she stood in the kitchen preparing Grace's morning bottle, she couldn't deny the tiny stab of disappointment that came with each passing day of silence. "Stop being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, testing the temperature of the formula against her wrist. "You wanted independence, remember?" Grace babbled from her high chair, banging a plastic spoon against the tray with the determined enthusiasm of a 1-year-old who discovered she could make noise. The sound echoed cheerfully through the spacious kitchen, and Emily smiled despite her confused emotions. The past 3 weeks had been a revelation. Grace was sleeping through the night for the first time in months, no longer jolted awake by the sounds of the shelter or the cramped discomfort of sleeping in the car. She was eating better, playing more, even taking tentative steps around the furniture with Emily cheering her on. And Emily herself was finally allowing her body to rest, to recover from months of survival mode. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and she'd even managed to find a part-time job at a local bakery that let her bring Grace to work during slow periods. She was just settling Grace in her high chair with a bowl of cut-up bananas when the doorbell rang. Emily froze, her heart immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. In her experience, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. The bell rang again, followed by a distinctly male voice calling, "Emily, it's Alexander." Emily's pulse kicked into overdrive for an entirely different reason. She glanced down at her appearance, yoga pants, an old sweater with a small hole near the hem, and hair that she'd pulled into a messy bun without bothering to look in a mirror. Not exactly the image of the grateful, put-together tenant she'd hoped to project. "Just a minute," she called, frantically trying to smooth her hair as she approached the door. Through the peephole, she could see Alexander standing in the hallway, looking as perfectly put together as ever, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Emily took a deep breath and opened the door, immediately struck by how the elegant hallway seemed to shrink around his presence. He was taller than she'd remembered, his shoulders broader, and there was something about seeing him in her space, well, his space that he was letting her use, that made her acutely aware of how domestic and disheveled she must look. "Hi," she said, then immediately felt stupid for the breathless quality of her voice. "I'm sorry for stopping by unannounced," Alexander said, his formal tone at odds with the way his eyes were drinking in every detail of her appearance. She looked settled, content. The haunted exhaustion that had shadowed her features that night at the diner was gone, replaced by a soft glow that made his chest tight with satisfaction. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check to see how you're settling in." "Of course. Come in." Emily stepped back, hyper-aware of Grace's delighted shriek from the kitchen. "Grace is having breakfast. Well, more like redecorating the kitchen with banana pieces, but she's happy." Alexander followed Emily into the apartment and stopped short at the sight of the living space. When he'd had the place furnished, it had been elegant but sterile, like a high-end hotel suite. Now there were signs of life everywhere, a basket of clean laundry on the sofa, Grace's toys scattered across the coffee table, a baby blanket draped over the back of the armchair, but it was the kitchen that made his breath catch. Grace sat in her high chair, banana smeared across her cherubic face, babbling happily as she spotted him. The sight hit him with unexpected force. This was what a home was supposed to look like, lived in, loved in, full of the beautiful chaos that came with actual family. "Dada!" Grace squealed, reaching sticky hands toward him. Emily's face went bright red. "She calls every man Dada lately. I think she picked it up from the other babies at the community center." "I'm sorry, I know it's fine," Alexander said quietly, moved by the child's enthusiasm despite Emily's embarrassment. "Hello, Grace. You're making quite the artistic statement with breakfast." Grace giggled and clapped, sending banana pieces flying. One landed squarely on Alexander's pristine white shirt, and Emily gasped in horror. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." Emily rushed forward with a dish towel, automatically reaching to dab at the stain on his chest before realizing what she was doing. The moment her fingers made contact with the solid muscle beneath his shirt, she froze, awareness crackling between them like electricity. Alexander's hand came up to cover hers, stilling the movement. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen. Emily's palm pressed against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. Alexander's larger hand warm and strong over hers. The kitchen fell silent except for Grace's cheerful babbling, but neither of them seemed to hear her. "It's just a shirt," Alexander said softly, his voice rougher than usual. His thumb brushed across Emily's knuckles, such a small gesture, but it sent heat shooting up her arm. "An expensive shirt," Emily whispered, unable to pull her gaze away from his. This close, she could see flecks of gold in his grey eyes, could smell his cologne, something subtle and masculine that made her want to step closer instead of backing away. "I have others," Alexander replied, though he made no move to release her hand. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, until Grace threw another piece of banana with a delighted shriek. The sound broke the spell, and Emily jerked backward, her cheeks flaming. "I should finish cleaning her up," Emily stammered, busying herself with wiping Grace's face to avoid looking at Alexander. "Of course," Alexander's voice was carefully controlled, but Emily could feel his eyes on her as she fussed over the baby. "How are you finding the apartment? Everything working properly?" "It's perfect," Emily said, grateful for the safe topic. "Better than perfect, really. Grace loves her room, and the kitchen is a dream. I've been experimenting with new recipes." She gestured toward the counter, where cooling racks held rows of what looked like professionally made pastries. Alexander moved closer to examine them, impressed despite himself. "Did you make those?" "Lemon scones for the bakery where I work," Emily explained, lifting Grace from her high chair. "My boss lets me use the kitchen here to test new recipes, and if customers like them, she adds them to the menu. It's nice to be creating something again instead of just surviving." There was quiet pride in her voice that made Alexander's chest tight with admiration. In 3 weeks, she'd gone from asking for leftovers to building a small business, all while caring for Grace single-handedly. The woman was remarkable. "They smell incredible," he said honestly. "Your mother taught you to bake." Emily's face softened with memory. "She did. Said food was love made visible and everyone deserved to taste love at least once a day." She paused, then looked at him shyly. "Would you like to try one? I made extra." Alexander nodded, accepting the offered scone. The first bite was revelation. Buttery, perfectly balanced sweet and tart, with a texture that dissolved on his tongue. It was better than anything he'd ever been served at five-star restaurants, and the fact that Emily had made it in his kitchen somehow made it taste even more extraordinary. "This is incredible," he said seriously. "You could sell these anywhere in the city." Emily's smile was radiant. Really, you're not just being nice? I don't do nice, Alexander replied with complete honesty. I do truth, and the truth is you have remarkable talent. The compliment hit Emily with unexpected force. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as more than a young woman in crisis, had acknowledged that she had skills and dreams beyond basic survival. Coming from Alexander, successful, sophisticated, obviously worldly, it felt like validation she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Grace chose that moment to reach for Alexander again, babbling insistently. Without thinking, Emily found herself asking, "Would you like to hold her? She clearly wants your attention." Alexander hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to overstep." "You're not overstepping," Emily assured him, then added with a small smile, "Besides, she's remarkably good at expressing her opinions. If she didn't want you here, trust me, you'd know." Alexander accepted Grace carefully, and the baby immediately settled against his chest with a contented sigh. The sight of this powerful, impeccably dressed man cradling her baby sister with such gentle care made Emily's heart do something complicated in her chest. "She's grown," Alexander observed, automatically adjusting his hold as Grace snuggled closer. "The pediatrician says she's right on track for her age now. She was a little underweight when we moved in, but good nutrition and consistent sleep have made a huge difference." Emily's voice carried quiet gratitude. "Thank you for all of this. I know I can never really repay—" "Don't," Alexander interrupted gently, his eyes meeting hers over Grace's head. "This isn't about repayment. It's about—" He trailed off, struggling with words that felt inadequate. "About what?" Emily asked softly. Alexander looked down at Grace, who was playing with his tie with the intense concentration only babies could manage. How could he explain that coming home to his empty mansion felt like punishment now? That he'd driven past this building 6 times in the past 3 weeks, fighting the urge to check on them? That holding this child felt more natural than anything he'd ever done in his carefully controlled life? "It's about doing what's right," he said finally, which was true but far from complete. Emily studied his face, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. There was warmth there, affection, something deeper than casual kindness. The realization was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Before she could analyze the feeling further, Grace made a grab for Alexander's expensive watch, and Emily automatically reached to stop her. Their hands collided, and suddenly they were standing close again, connected by the baby between them and something neither was quite ready to name. "I should probably go," Alexander said quietly, though he made no move to hand Grace back. "Probably," Emily agreed, though she didn't step away. Neither of them moved. Grace babbled happily, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults, and for a moment the kitchen was filled with a domestic intimacy that felt almost too precious to disturb. Then Alexander's phone rang, harsh and intrusive, breaking the spell. He sighed and carefully transferred Grace back to Emily's arms, his fingers lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "I really should take this," he said apologetically. "Of course," Emily replied, trying to ignore the way her skin tingled where he'd touched her. "Thank you for stopping by. It was nice to see you." "Nice to see you too," Alexander said, and meant it more than he cared to examine. "Both of you." As Emily walked him to the door, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave this warm, banana-scented bubble of domesticity. His real life, board meetings and profit margins and empty penthouse dinners, felt cold and artificial in comparison. "Emily," he said as she opened the door, "if you ever need anything at all, please call. Don't hesitate." "I will," Emily promised, though they both knew she probably wouldn't. She was too proud, too determined to prove her independence. But as Alexander walked away, Emily found herself hoping he would find another reason to visit soon, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was beginning to imagine what it might feel like to not face everything alone. 2 days after Alexander's unexpected visit, Emily found herself humming while she prepared Grace's evening bath. The melody was something her mother used to sing, and Emily realized with a start that it was the first time she'd hummed anything since the funeral. The apartment seemed to be working some kind of magic on her, restoring pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever. Grace splashed happily in her little bathtub, creating tiny tsunami waves that soaked Emily's sleeves. "You're supposed to get clean, not redecorate the bathroom," Emily laughed, gently washing banana residue from Grace's hair. The baby had discovered that food made excellent finger paint, and mealtimes had become increasingly creative affairs. The doorbell rang just as Emily was wrapping Grace in a fluffy towel. She glanced at the clock, 7:30, an unusual time for visitors. Through the peephole, she saw a uniformed delivery man holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. "Delivery for Emily Carter," the man announced when she opened the door. "I think there's been a mistake," Emily said, bewildered. "I didn't order flowers." "No mistake, ma'am. These are from a Mr. Blackwood. He said to tell you they're a thank you for the scones." Emily's heart did something acrobatic in her chest as she accepted the bouquet. The flowers were gorgeous, white roses mixed with something that looked like baby's breath, arranged with an artistry that spoke of expensive florists and careful thought. After the delivery man left, Emily found the card nestled among the blooms. "For the baker who makes love visible. Thank you for the reminder that beauty exists in everyday moments. A." Emily read the card 3 times before Grace's fussing reminded her that it was bedtime. As she prepared Grace's bottle and settled into the nursery's rocking chair, Emily found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the flowers now gracing the kitchen table. No one had ever sent her flowers before. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not ever. The gesture was thoughtful without being presumptuous, elegant without being overwhelming, just like the man who'd sent them. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse office, Alexander was attempting to focus on quarterly reports and failing miserably. Every time he tried to concentrate on profit margins, his mind wandered to the memory of Emily's fingers pressed against his chest, the way her eyes had widened when she realized what she was doing, the soft warmth of her palm through his shirt. He'd sent the flowers on impulse, telling himself it was simple gratitude for the scones that had been the best thing he'd tasted in months. But sitting in his sterile office, surrounded by awards and achievements that suddenly felt hollow, Alexander had to admit the truth. He was thinking about Emily Carter, far more than was appropriate for a landlord concerned about his tenants' welfare. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Reminder, dinner with Victoria Pemberton at 8 p.m. Le Bernardin." Alexander stared at the message with something approaching dread. Victoria was beautiful, accomplished, from the right social circles, everything his father would have approved of in a potential daughter-in-law. Their arrangement was more business partnership than romance. She needed a respectable escort for social functions. He needed someone who understood that his work came first. It was practical, uncomplicated, and utterly devoid of any real feeling. 3 weeks ago, that had been exactly what he wanted. Now, as he straightened his tie and prepared for another evening of polite conversation about mutual acquaintances and market trends, Alexander found himself wondering what Emily was doing. Was Grace asleep? Was Emily reading in that comfortable armchair by the window, maybe wearing those soft yoga pants that made her look so approachable and real? The dinner with Victoria was exactly as predicted, elegant, sophisticated, and mind-numbingly boring. She spoke intelligently about art acquisitions and charity galas, laughed at appropriate moments, and looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Alexander nodded and responded at the right times, but his attention kept drifting. "You seem distracted tonight," Victoria observed as they waited for dessert. Her tone was curious rather than hurt. Their relationship had never involved enough genuine emotion for hurt feelings. "Just work concerns," Alexander replied automatically. Victoria studied him with shrewd blue eyes. "You know, Alexander, in all the time we've been seeing each other, I've never known work to distract you from a conversation. You compartmentalize better than anyone I know." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. "What's her name?" Alexander's wineglass froze halfway to his lips. "Excuse me? The woman who's got you so distracted you've barely heard a word I've said tonight." Victoria's smile was knowing rather than jealous. "I'm not blind, darling. You have that look men get when they're thinking about someone specific." "I don't know what you're talking about," Alexander said, but even he could hear how unconvincing he sounded. "Of course you don't," Victoria replied smoothly. "Just as I'm sure you don't realize you've been unconsciously checking your phone all evening, or that you smiled more during the 5 minutes you were reading that text about flower deliveries than you have during our entire meal." Alexander looked down at his phone, realizing she was right. He had been checking for messages, though he couldn't say what he was hoping to receive. Emily had no reason to contact him, and he had no excuse to contact her. "Victoria." "Relax, Alexander. I'm not having a fit of jealous rage." Victoria's laugh was genuinely amused. "We both know what this is between us. Convenience, compatibility, a mutually beneficial arrangement." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "But whoever she is, she's woken something up in you that I've never seen before. That's not something to dismiss lightly." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, turning Victoria's words over in his mind. "What if it's complicated?" "The best things usually are," Victoria replied. "The question is whether the complication is worth it." Later that evening, after he'd walked Victoria to her car and endured her knowing smile as she wished him luck with his mystery woman, Alexander found himself driving through Maple Heights. He told himself he was just taking a longer road home, but when he saw the warm glow of lights in Emily's apartment windows, he pulled over and sat in his car like some lovesick teenager. Through the gauzy curtains, he could see Emily moving around the kitchen, probably cleaning up after dinner. The sight of her domestic routine, so ordinary, so real, made his chest ache with longing for something he couldn't quite name. His phone rang, startling him out of his reverie. Emily's number appeared on the screen, and Alexander's heart rate spiked as he answered. "Emily, is everything all right?" "Oh, yes, everything's fine." Emily's voice was slightly breathless, as if she'd been hurrying. "I just wanted to thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful, and you really didn't need to—" "Did you like them?" Alexander interrupted, surprised by how much her answer mattered to him. "I loved them," Emily said softly. "No one's ever sent me flowers before." It was incredibly thoughtful. Alexander felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the quiet wonder in her voice. "I'm glad you enjoyed them. The scones deserved proper appreciation." Still, it was too generous. "You've already done so much." "Emily," Alexander's voice was gentle but firm, "please stop trying to minimize every kindness. You're allowed to accept gifts graciously without feeling indebted." There was a pause, and when Emily spoke again, her voice was smaller. "It's just hard to believe sometimes that someone would do nice things without expecting anything in return." Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he processed the pain hidden in those words. What kind of experiences had taught her to be so suspicious of kindness? What kind of men had she known before? "Not everyone has ulterior motives," he said quietly. "Sometimes people do nice things simply because they want to see you smile." "Is that why you sent them?" Emily asked, and there was something in her voice, hope maybe or curiosity, that made Alexander's pulse quicken. Alexander looked up at her apartment window, seeing her shadow move across the curtains, and felt the truth rise in his throat like a confession. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly why." The silence that followed was charged with awareness, both of them processing the subtle shift that admission represented. They were moving into territory that had nothing to do with landlord and tenant, nothing to do with charity or practical arrangements. "Alexander," Emily's voice was soft, uncertain. "Yes? Are you—" She seemed to struggle with the question. "Are you involved with someone? Romantically, I mean." The question hit Alexander like a physical blow, followed immediately by a surge of hope that Emily cared enough to ask. "What makes you ask that?" "I saw the society page today," Emily admitted, embarrassment coloring her voice. "There was a photo of you at some charity event with a beautiful woman. I didn't want to misunderstand what the flowers meant if you're already with someone." Alexander closed his eyes, silently cursing the photographer who'd captured him and Victoria at last month's hospital fundraiser. "Victoria is a friend," he said carefully. "We attend social functions together sometimes, but it's not romantic." "Oh." Emily's relief was audible. "I'm sorry, I had no right to ask. It's none of my business." "It's okay," Alexander said, and meant it. The fact that she'd asked, that it mattered to her, made his heart race with possibilities he'd been trying not to consider. "Emily?" "Yes?" "What I said about wanting to see you smile, I meant it. That's all I want. Your happiness, your peace of mind. Nothing complicated, nothing that makes you uncomfortable." "What if it already is complicated?" Emily whispered. and Alexander's breath caught at the admission. Before he could respond, he heard Grace crying in the background, and Emily sighed softly. "I should go. Someone's decided that bedtime is optional tonight." "Of course. Give Grace my love." Alexander stopped, realizing what he'd said, but Emily's soft laugh suggested she wasn't bothered by the slip. "I will. Thank you again for the flowers, Alexander. They really are beautiful." After she hung up, Alexander sat in his car for another 10 minutes, watching Emily's silhouette as she moved through the apartment, presumably settling Grace for the night. The domestic scene filled him with a yearning so intense it was almost painful. Victoria had been right about one thing. Emily had woken something up in him, something he'd spent years carefully suppressing. The question now was what he was going to do about it. As he finally drove home to his empty penthouse, Alexander found himself planning his next visit to Maple Heights. Because whatever was happening between them, complicated or not, he wasn't ready to let it go. Back in the apartment, Emily stood at the kitchen window, watching Alexander's car disappear into the night. She hadn't seen him sitting there, but something had drawn her to the window just as his taillights vanished around the corner. Her fingers traced the petals of the white roses, and she allowed herself to admit what she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. She was falling for Alexander Blackwood, hard and fast and completely against her better judgment. The smart thing would be to maintain boundaries, to keep their relationship strictly professional. But as Emily breathed in the sweet scent of the flowers he'd sent, just to make her smile, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, the smart thing wasn't always the right thing. Some risks, she was beginning to think, might be worth taking after all. Emily was elbow-deep in bread dough at Morrison's bakery when she heard the familiar jingle of the front doorbell. She looked up from the industrial mixer, flour dusting her apron and wisps of hair escaping from her ponytail, to see a man in an expensive suit scanning the display cases with obvious disdain. "Can I help you?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel as she approached the counter. The man looked her up and down with calculating eyes that made Emily's skin crawl. He was handsome in a polished, artificial way, perfectly styled hair, bleached teeth, manicured nails that had never seen a day of honest work. Everything about him screamed money and entitlement. "I'm looking for Emily Carter," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "That's me." Emily kept her voice carefully neutral, but warning bells were going off in her head. "Do I know you?" "Marcus Wellington III," he introduced himself as if the name should impress her. "I represent certain business interests in the city. I understand you've recently come into some advantageous living arrangements." Emily's blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean." Marcus smiled, the expression predatory rather than friendly. "Come now, Miss Carter. A young woman like yourself doesn't simply land a luxury apartment in Maple Heights without certain accommodations being made. I'm prepared to offer you a much more lucrative arrangement." The implication hit Emily like a slap. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "Now, don't be hasty. I said get out." Emily's voice rose, drawing the attention of other customers. "I don't know who you are or what you think you know about my situation, but you're wrong, and you're not welcome here." Marcus's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Miss Carter. My offer is quite generous, and I don't make it often. A woman in your position should consider all her options carefully." Before Emily could respond, Mrs. Morrison emerged from the back office, her matronly face stern with protective anger. "You heard her, mister. Out now before I call the police." Marcus straightened his tie with deliberate calm. "This conversation isn't over," he told Emily, his voice carrying a promise that made her blood run cold. He dropped a business card on the counter and walked out, leaving Emily trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. "What was that about?" Mrs. Morrison asked, moving protectively closer to Emily. "I have no idea," Emily said honestly, staring at the business card as if it might explain everything. "He seemed to think that I had some kind of arrangement with someone." She couldn't bring herself to voice the ugly implication. Mrs. Morrison's expression softened with understanding. "Oh, honey, some people see a young woman with a baby and jump to the worst conclusions. Don't you pay him any mind." But Emily couldn't shake the encounter. As she worked through the rest of her shift, her mind kept returning to Marcus's words. How had he known about the apartment, and what had he meant about certain business interests? By the time she picked up Grace from the daycare Mrs. Morrison provided for her employees, Emily was thoroughly rattled. She found herself looking over her shoulder as she walked to the bus stop, Marcus's promise that their conversation wasn't over echoing in her mind. The feeling of being watched persisted during the bus ride home. Every time she glanced around, she saw nothing suspicious, but the prickly sensation between her shoulder blades wouldn't go away. Grace, sensitive to her sister's mood, was fussier than usual, adding to Emily's stress. When they finally reached the apartment building, Emily was relieved to see James at his usual post behind the front desk. The elderly doorman had become something of a protective grandfather figure over the past month, always ready with a smile for Grace and a kind word for Emily. "Evening, Miss Carter," James greeted them warmly. "How was your day?" "Eventful," Emily replied with forced lightness, not wanting to worry him. "Any visitors today?" "Just the usual, mail delivery, maintenance check on the HVAC system. Oh, and Mr. Blackwood stopped by around 3, but you weren't in. Said he'd try again later." Emily felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. After their phone conversation 2 nights ago, she'd been both hoping for and dreading another encounter with Alexander. The memory of his voice saying he wanted to see her smile, the admission that things were already complicated. It all felt too intense and dangerous for someone in her precarious situation. "Did he say what he wanted?" she asked as they entered the elevator. "Just that he hoped you and little Grace were doing well," James replied. "Nice man, Mr. Blackwood. You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat folks like me. He always makes time to ask about my grandchildren, remembers their names and everything." The observation warmed Emily despite her anxiety. In her experience, truly kind people were rare, and the fact that Alexander treated everyone with respect spoke well of his character. Back in the apartment, Emily tried to settle into their usual evening routine, but she found herself jumping at every small sound. Grace picked up on her tension and refused to eat her dinner, instead throwing spoonfuls of mashed sweet potato with the determination of a tiny food critic expressing displeasure. "Come on, Gracie," Emily coaxed, cleaning orange goop off the high chair tray for the 3rd time. "You love sweet potatoes? What's the problem tonight?" Grace responded by launching another spoonful across the kitchen, this one landing squarely on Emily's shirt. Emily closed her eyes and counted to 10, reminding herself that 1-year-olds weren't capable of malicious intent, even when it felt personal. The doorbell rang just as Emily was contemplating the possibility that Grace had developed psychic powers and was expressing Emily's own emotional state through food throwing. Emily's heart leaped. With hope or fear, she wasn't sure. Through the peephole, she saw Alexander standing in the hallway, looking as impeccably put together as ever, despite the late hour. Emily glanced down at her sweet potato-stained shirt and sighed. There was no help for it. "Hi," she said, as she opened the door, unconsciously trying to smooth her disheveled hair. Alexander's formal greeting died on his lips as he took in Emily's appearance. Her hair was escaping from its ponytail in soft tendrils that framed her flushed face. There was what looked like baby food on her shirt, and she had that particular look of frazzled exhaustion that came with caring for a cranky toddler. She looked real and human and utterly lovely, and Alexander felt his chest tighten with affection. "Rough evening?" he asked gently. "Grace has decided that dinner is actually a contact sport," Emily replied with a tired laugh. "Come in, but watch out for flying food. She's got excellent aim when she wants to." Alexander stepped into the apartment and was immediately struck by the sounds of domestic chaos. Grace's indignant babbling from the kitchen, the dishwasher running, music playing softly from Emily's phone. It was so different from the sterile silence of his own home that he felt something loosen in his chest. "Dada!" Grace shrieked when she spotted Alexander, clapping her hands with delight and sending sweet potato flying. "She's definitely happy to see you," Emily observed, moving to wipe down the high chair, which is more than I can say for her feelings about dinner. Alexander approached the high chair, loosening his tie as Grace reached for him with sticky orange hands. "Hello, beautiful girl. Are you giving your sister a hard time tonight?" Grace babbled what sounded like an explanation, gesturing emphatically toward her rejected dinner. Alexander listened with mock seriousness, nodding as if he understood every word. "I see," he said gravely. The sweet potatoes weren't properly seasoned, a common complaint among discriminating diners. He looked at Emily with twinkling eyes. She's clearly inherited refined taste buds. Emily couldn't help but laugh at the absurd conversation. Refined taste buds that prefer crackers and bananas to actual nutritious food. The best critics are often the most difficult to please, Alexander replied, then surprised Emily by rolling up his sleeves and moving toward the sink. May I? May you what? Help with cleanup duty. You look like you could use an extra pair of hands. Emily stared at him in amazement. You want to help clean baby food off my kitchen? In your expensive suit? The suit will survive, Alexander said, already running water in the sink. Besides, Grace seems to have designated me as her preferred dinner companion. I should probably learn the routine. There was something about the way he said it, casual, as if his presence in their evening routine was a given rather than an extraordinary occurrence, that made Emily's heart skip. She watched in fascination as Alexander Blackwood, CEO of a financial empire, competently loaded sweet potato-covered dishes into the dishwasher with the same focused attention he probably gave to billion-dollar mergers. You don't have to do this, Emily said softly. I know. Alexander glanced at her, his expression warm. I want to. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Alexander washing while Emily dried and put things away. Grace watched from her high chair with fascination, occasionally offering commentary in her unique baby language. It was Emily who finally voiced what they were both thinking. This is strange, isn't it? You helping with my dishes like we're... She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Like we're what? Alexander asked quietly, not looking away from the soapy bowl in his hands. Like we're a family, Emily whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Alexander's hands stilled in the dishwater. When he looked at her, there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Emily's breath catch. Would that be so terrible? Before Emily could answer, Grace let out a huge yawn and rubbed her eyes with the backs of her hands. The universal baby signal for I'm tired, but I'm going to fight sleep for as long as possible. Someone needs a bath and bed, Emily said, grateful for the interruption that saved her from having to answer Alexander's question. Grace, can you say goodnight to Alexander? Grace looked at Alexander and made a kissing noise, one of her newest and most adorable tricks. Alexander's face softened with genuine affection. Good night, sweetheart, he said, gently stroking Grace's cheek. Sweet dreams. As Emily lifted Grace from the high chair, the baby reached for Alexander one more time, babbling what sounded like a request. Alexander looked at Emily questioningly. She wants you to come with us, Emily interpreted. To her room. She's gotten attached to you. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications. Alexander followed Emily down the hall to Grace's nursery, watching as Emily efficiently managed the bedtime routine, changing Grace's diaper, getting her into pajamas, filling her bottle with warm milk. Would you like to feed her? Emily asked suddenly. She might settle better for you. She's been fighting sleep all week. Alexander accepted the bottle carefully, settling into the rocking chair with Grace cradled against his chest. The baby looked up at him with sleepy eyes, her tiny hand curling around his finger as she drank. Emily perched on the edge of the changing table, watching this powerful man rock her baby sister with infinite gentleness. The sight did something complicated to her heart, made her feel safe and terrified all at once. You're good at this, she said softly. She makes it easy, Alexander replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's eyes were growing heavy, her sucking slowing as sleep began to win. She's remarkable, Emily, you both are. The simple words, spoken with such quiet sincerity, made Emily's eyes fill with unexpected tears. She blinked them back, but not before Alexander noticed. Hey, he said gently, careful not to disturb Grace. What's wrong? Emily shook her head, unable to trust her voice. How could she explain that no one had ever called her remarkable before? That watching him care for Grace with such natural affection was breaking down every wall she'd built to protect her heart. Grace had fallen asleep, her bottle dropping away as she relaxed completely against Alexander's chest. He continued rocking gently, unwilling to disturb the perfect peace of the moment. I had an unsettling encounter today, Emily said finally, needing to tell someone about Marcus Wellington and not sure who else she could trust. Alexander's attention sharpened immediately. What kind of encounter? Emily told him about Marcus's visit to the bakery, watching Alexander's expression grow progressively darker as she described the man's implications and veiled threats. "Son of a bitch," Alexander said quietly, his voice vibrating with controlled fury. Grace stirred slightly at the tension in his voice, and he immediately gentled his tone. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No, you're right to be angry," Emily said, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in his reaction. "It was awful. He made me feel like I was some kind of prostitute or something." Alexander's jaw clenched so hard, Emily worried he might break a tooth. "Give me his card." "Alexander, give me his card, Emily." His voice was deadly quiet. "No one talks to you that way." "No one." Emily retrieved Marcus's business card from her purse, watching as Alexander studied it with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "Marcus Wellington III," Alexander read aloud, his voice dripping with disdain. "I know his family. Old money, new problems. The third generation that manages to squander everything the first two built." He looked at Emily with grim determination. "He won't bother you again. You can't just—" "I can, and I will." Alexander's tone brooked no argument. "Emily, this man approached you at your workplace and essentially propositioned you based on assumptions about our arrangement. That's harassment at minimum, possibly something worse." He crossed a line. Emily felt something warm and fierce unfurl in her chest at Alexander's protective anger. No one had ever defended her like this before, with such immediate and uncompromising fury at the thought of someone threatening her. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. "Make some phone calls," Alexander said, his voice returning to its normal tone as he transferred the sleeping Grace to Emily's arms. "Wellington's family has business interests that intersect with mine. I imagine a conversation about appropriate professional conduct would be educational for him." As Emily settled Grace in her crib, she was acutely aware of Alexander standing behind her, a solid and reassuring presence in the soft lamplight of the nursery. When she turned around, they were standing close together in the intimate space, and the air between them seemed to thicken with awareness. "Thank you," Emily whispered, "for offering to help, for caring about what happened to me." "Always," Alexander replied, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "Emily, I need you to understand something. What's happening between us, whatever this is, it has nothing to do with the apartment or any sense of obligation. You don't owe me anything, and I'm not expecting anything in return for helping you." "Then why?" Emily asked, the question she'd been afraid to voice finally escaping. "Why do you care so much about what happens to us?" Alexander looked down at her, his grey eyes intense in the nursery's soft lighting. When he spoke, his words were careful but weighted with significance. "Because somewhere between that night in the diner and watching you make a home in my empty apartment, I started caring about you, both of you, more than I should, probably more than is wise, but I can't seem to help myself." Emily's breath caught at the honesty in his admission. "Alexander, I know it's complicated," he continued, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I know you have every reason to be cautious, but I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I hope, that maybe you feel something too." Emily's heart was racing so fast she was sure he could hear it in the quiet nursery. The touch of his fingers against her cheek was sending electricity through her entire nervous system, and the look in his eyes was making it hard to remember all the reasons this was a bad idea. "I do feel something," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. "That's what scares me." Alexander's thumb traced gently across her cheekbone, and Emily found herself leaning into the touch, despite her better judgment. "It scares me too," he admitted. "I've never felt like this before, Emily. I don't know the rules." They were standing so close now that Emily could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of baby soap from holding Grace. When Alexander's gaze dropped to her lips, Emily felt her knees weaken with want and anticipation, but just as he began to lean closer, Grace made a soft sound from her crib, and the spell broke. Emily stepped back, her cheeks flushed and her breathing unsteady. "I should let you get some rest," Alexander said, his voice rough with restraint. "It's been a long day." Emily nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As they walked toward the front door, the air between them crackled with unfinished business and unspoken possibilities. "Emily," Alexander said as she opened the door, "tomorrow I want you to take a cab to and from work. I'll arrange it with a service I use. They'll know to bill me." That's not necessary. Please. Alexander's voice was gentle but implacable. Until I can make sure Wellington understands that bothering you was a serious mistake, I want to know you're safe. For my peace of mind, if nothing else. Emily looked into his eyes and saw genuine concern mixed with something fiercer, a protectiveness that made her feel cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. Okay, she said softly. Thank you. Alexander nodded, then surprised her by leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. The touch was soft, reverent, and completely devastating in its tenderness. Sweet dreams, Emily, he murmured against her skin. Both of you. After he left, Emily stood with her back against the closed door, her fingers pressed to the spot where his lips had touched. Her heart was still racing, her skin still tingling from that simple, chaste kiss that had somehow felt more intimate than anything she'd ever experienced. She was falling for Alexander Blackwood, completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love with a man who was so far out of her league they weren't even playing the same sport. But as Emily finally headed to bed, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some falls, she was beginning to think, were worth the landing. The next morning brought news that made Emily's coffee taste bitter in her mouth. Mrs. Morrison bustled into the bakery's back kitchen with a copy of the society section, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "Honey, isn't this your gentleman friend?" she asked, spreading the newspaper on the flour-dusted counter. Emily's heart sank as she looked at the photograph. There was Alexander, devastatingly handsome in a black tuxedo, his arm around the waist of the most beautiful woman Emily had ever seen. The caption read, "Banking heir Alexander Blackwood escorts socialite Victoria Pemberton to the Metropolitan Museum's annual gala. Sources close to the couple suggest an engagement announcement may be forthcoming." Emily stared at the image, feeling something crack open in her chest. The woman, Victoria, was everything Emily would never be. Tall, elegant, wearing a gown that probably cost more than Emily made in 6 months. She looked like she belonged in Alexander's world of charity galas and business empires, looked like she was born to be on his arm. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Morrison said softly, reading Emily's expression. "I'm sure there's an explanation." "There doesn't need to be," Emily said quickly, her voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Blackwood is free to date whoever he wants. He's my landlord, that's all." But even as she said the words, Emily felt their falseness burn her throat. Last night in Grace's nursery, when he'd almost kissed her, when he'd admitted to caring about her, that hadn't felt like a landlord's concern. That had felt like something real, something precious. Apparently she'd been wrong. Emily threw herself into her work with renewed determination, kneading bread dough with more force than strictly necessary. She told herself it was better to know the truth now, before she'd done something truly stupid, like fall completely in love with Alexander Blackwood. She told herself she was grateful for the reminder of the vast differences between their worlds. She told herself a lot of things that felt like lies. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Every time the front door chimed, Emily's heart leaped with the irrational hope that it might be Alexander coming to explain the photograph. But the explanation never came, and with each passing hour, Emily felt her fragile hopes crumbling into something that felt suspiciously like heartbreak. By closing time, Emily had convinced herself that everything between them had been in her imagination. The flowers, the gentle way he'd held Grace, the almost kiss in the nursery, it was all just kindness from a wealthy man who felt sorry for her circumstances. The fact that she'd misinterpreted his charity as something deeper was her own fault for allowing herself to hope for something impossible. The cab Alexander had arranged was waiting outside the bakery, just as he'd promised. Emily settled Grace into the car seat she'd borrowed from Mrs. Morrison, trying not to think about how thoughtful the gesture was. Even if his romantic interest lay elsewhere, Alexander was still a good man who kept his word about ensuring their safety. Back at the apartment, Emily went through the motions of their evening routine with mechanical efficiency. Grace seemed to sense her sister's subdued mood and was unusually clingy, fussing whenever Emily tried to put her down. By the time Emily finally got the baby settled for bed, she felt emotionally wrung out. She was just sinking into the living room armchair with a cup of tea when the doorbell rang. Emily's heart leaped before she could stop it, and she cursed herself for the involuntary reaction. Through the peephole, she saw Alexander standing in the hallway, looking as perfectly put together as ever, but somehow more tense than usual. Emily considered not answering. She considered pretending she was asleep or that Grace was sick, or any number of excuses that would save her from having to face him while her emotions were still so raw. But Grace chose that moment to let out a cry from her bedroom, and Emily knew he'd heard her. "Hi," Emily said as she opened the door, her voice carefully neutral. "Emily." Alexander's eyes immediately went to her face, taking in the subtle signs of distress, the tightness around her eyes, the way she held herself slightly apart from the door. "Is everything all right? You seem upset." "I'm fine," Emily replied, stepping back to let him in. "Grace is having trouble sleeping tonight. She's been fussy all day." Alexander followed her into the apartment, his attention focused completely on Emily, despite her claim that Grace was the problem. He'd become expert at reading her moods over the past weeks, and everything about her body language screamed emotional distress. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked gently. "And please don't say nothing. I can see that something's bothering you." Emily moved to the kitchen under the pretense of washing her teacup, needing the distance and the activity to maintain her composure. "I saw the newspaper today," she said finally, not looking at him. "The society section. You looked very handsome at the gala." Alexander went still, pieces clicking into place. The photograph from last night's museum event. He'd completely forgotten about the press coverage. "Emily, you don't need to explain anything," Emily continued, scrubbing the already clean mug with unnecessary vigor. "I understand that someone in your position has social obligations. She took a shaky breath. "I think maybe we should clarify some boundaries, for both our sakes." "What kind of boundaries?" Alexander's voice was carefully controlled, but Emily could hear the tension underneath. Emily finally turned to face him, her chin lifted in a gesture of determined dignity that made Alexander's chest ache. "Professional ones. You're my landlord, and I'm your tenant. That's all this can be, and I was wrong to hope for anything more." "Emily, that photograph showed you with someone who belongs in your world," Emily interrupted. "Someone beautiful and sophisticated and appropriate for a man in your position. I'm not that person, Alexander. I never could be." Alexander stared at her, recognizing the walls she was rebuilding between them with each carefully controlled word. "You think I care about any of that? About what's appropriate or what other people think belongs in my world?" "You should," Emily said quietly. "Because this," she gestured between them, "this is just fantasy. A story we've been telling ourselves because we're lonely and the situation is unusual. But it's not real life." "The hell it isn't," Alexander said sharply, then caught himself as Grace's cries grew louder from the bedroom. "Can I?" he asked, gesturing toward the hallway. Emily nodded, following him to Grace's nursery, where the baby was working herself into a full meltdown. Alexander lifted Grace from her crib without hesitation, settling her against his chest as he began the gentle swaying motion that always seemed to calm her. "Shh, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice taking on the soft tone he always used with Grace. "It's okay, Uncle Alexander's here." The word uncle hit Emily like a physical blow. Of course, that's how he saw his role in their lives. A benevolent family friend, someone who cared about their welfare but had no romantic investment in their relationship. The realization should have been comforting, should have made everything clearer and simpler. Instead, it made Emily want to cry. Grace settled quickly in Alexander's arms, her sobs tapering off to occasional hiccups as she recognized his familiar warmth. Alexander continued rocking her, his attention divided between the baby and Emily, who was standing frozen in the doorway. "Emily," Alexander said quietly, not wanting to disturb Grace but needing to address the growing distance he could feel Emily putting between them. "Victoria is not my girlfriend. We attend social functions together because it's convenient for both of us, but there's nothing romantic between us." The caption was "speculation by a reporter who doesn't know anything about my personal life," Alexander interrupted gently. "I've never even kissed Victoria, Emily, never wanted to." Emily looked up at him, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. "Then why do you go to those events together?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because until recently, I didn't care enough about anyone to want more than a convenient arrangement. Victoria understands that my work comes first, and she's never expected anything from me beyond proper escort duties and reasonable conversation. "And now?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep in his arms, then back at Emily. "Now I find myself wanting things I never thought I needed. Now I go to those events wishing I was somewhere else entirely. Now I check my phone every 5 minutes, hoping for messages from someone who never sends them, because she's too proud to ask for anything she doesn't absolutely need." Emily felt her carefully constructed defenses wavering. "Alexander, I know you think we're from different worlds," Alexander continued, carefully transferring Grace to Emily's arms. "And maybe we are. But Emily, the way I feel about you has nothing to do with social status or what looks good on paper. It has to do with the fact that you're the strongest, most genuinely kind person I've ever met. It has to do with the way you make me laugh, the way you turn an empty apartment into a home, the way you've never once asked me for anything beyond what you absolutely needed." Emily settled Grace in her crib, using the moment to compose herself. When she turned back to Alexander, there were tears in her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of believing this is real and having it all disappear when you realize what a mistake you've made. I'm scared of Grace getting attached to you and then losing you. I'm scared of falling in love with someone I can't have." Alexander stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame Emily's face with infinite gentleness. "What if you already have me? What if I'm the one who's scared of losing you?" Emily's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Victoria means nothing to me beyond friendship. I'm saying that I think about you constantly, dream about you, count the hours until I can see you again." Alexander's thumbs traced across Emily's cheekbones, wiping away tears she didn't realize had fallen. "I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, Emily Carter, and I don't give a damn about what anyone else thinks is appropriate." Emily stared up at him, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and terror. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Completely," Alexander agreed, leaning his forehead against hers. "But it's also the most real thing I've ever felt." They stood like that in the soft lamplight of Grace's nursery, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, on the edge of something that felt too big and too precious to name. Emily could feel the warmth radiating from Alexander's body, could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of Grace's baby soap, could see the sincerity and vulnerability in his grey eyes. "Alexander," she breathed, his name a prayer and a question all at once. "Yes? If we do this, if we try this, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Alexander said without hesitation. "Promise me that Grace comes first, that whatever happens between us, you won't hurt her. She's lost too much already, and if she gets attached to you and you leave—" Emily's voice cracked with the weight of her fear. Alexander's expression grew fierce with protectiveness. "Emily, I would never hurt Grace. Never. That little girl has already stolen my heart completely. Whatever happens between us, she will always have a place in my life. I promise you that." The sincerity in his voice, the way his eyes blazed with protective love when he spoke about Grace, broke through the last of Emily's defenses. This man who could have anyone and anything he wanted was choosing them. Choosing her sister. Choosing their complicated little family. Choosing the messy reality of loving someone who came with responsibilities and histories and fears. "I love you," Emily whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I tried not to. I tried to convince myself it was just gratitude or proximity or some kind of temporary insanity. But I love you. Completely. Terrifyingly." Alexander's entire face transformed at her confession, hope and joy, and something that looked like relief flooding his features. "Say it again," he said softly. "I love you," Emily repeated, stronger this time, more certain. "I love you, Alexander Blackwood." "Thank God," Alexander breathed, and then his lips were on hers, soft and desperate and perfect. Emily melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with all the love and longing she'd been trying to deny. The kiss was everything their almost kiss the night before had promised and more. Gentle but passionate, sweet but intense, full of all the words they'd been too afraid to say. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against Emily's once again. "I love you too," he whispered against her lips. "So much it terrifies me." "Good," Emily said with a shaky laugh. "At least we're equally terrified." Alexander chuckled, the sound low and intimate in the quiet nursery. We're really doing this, aren't we? I think we are, Emily replied, still hardly able to believe it was real. Emily? No more newspapers, no more assumptions. If something's bothering you, talk to me, promise? Emily nodded, understanding the importance of communication in whatever they were building together. I promise. But Alexander? Yes? No more society galas with Victoria. I know it's probably irrational, but… Done, Alexander interrupted with a smile. I was already planning to tell her I wouldn't be available for escort duty anymore. She'll probably be relieved. She's been telling me for weeks that I've been distracted and poor company. Emily laughed, the sound bright and happy in a way that made Alexander's heart soar. Poor Victoria. She probably thought you were having a midlife crisis. Maybe I am, Alexander said thoughtfully. Or maybe I'm just finally figuring out what actually matters. As they finally left Grace's nursery and settled together on the living room sofa, Emily curled against Alexander's side like she belonged there. Both of them knew they were crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Whatever came next would be complicated and probably difficult, full of challenges they couldn't anticipate. But sitting there in the quiet apartment, Grace sleeping peacefully down the hall, and Emily's heart beating against his chest, Alexander thought that maybe the best things in life were worth fighting for. And Emily, with Alexander's arms strong and sure around her, allowed herself to believe that sometimes fairy tales did come true. They just looked different than you expected. Some love stories, she realized, didn't start with glass slippers and royal balls. Sometimes they started with leftovers and desperation, grew in the soil of kindness and trust, and bloomed into something more beautiful than any fantasy could ever be. This was their story, complicated and real and absolutely perfect in its imperfection, and Emily couldn't wait to see how it would end. 3 weeks after their first kiss, Emily woke up to the sound of Grace giggling in her crib and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. She lay in bed for a moment, savoring the domestic peace that had become their new normal, before the reality hit her. She hadn't made coffee. Wrapping her robe around herself, Emily padded to the kitchen to find Alexander standing at the stove, fully dressed in another impeccable suit, expertly flipping what appeared to be pancakes. Grace sat in her high chair, banging a spoon against her tray while Alexander carried on a serious conversation with her about the proper technique for achieving the perfect golden brown. You do realize it's 6 in the morning? Emily said, leaning against the doorframe with a smile she couldn't suppress. Even after 3 weeks of Alexander showing up at unexpected hours, she still felt a little thrill at finding him in her kitchen. Grace and I are early risers, Alexander replied without turning around, though Emily could hear the smile in his voice. We've been discussing breakfast strategy for the past 20 minutes. She's quite opinionated about the pancake-to-syrup ratio. Dada, Grace squealed when she spotted Emily, reaching sticky hands toward her sister. Emily's heart did its usual complicated dance at Grace's continued insistence on calling Alexander Dada. They'd tried to correct her at first, but Alexander had quietly asked Emily to let it go. She needs a father figure, he'd said, and I like being needed by her. Morning, baby girl, Emily murmured, dropping a kiss on Grace's head, before moving to peer over Alexander's shoulder at the stove. Those look professional. Years of boarding school self-sufficiency, Alexander explained, sliding a perfect golden pancake onto the warming plate. I may not look like it, but I'm actually quite domestic when necessary. Emily stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne mixed with maple syrup and coffee. Even after 3 weeks of stolen kisses and growing intimacy, she still felt slightly amazed that this was her life now. You don't have to take care of us, you know, Emily said softly, though she made no move to step away from his warmth. Alexander turned in her arms, the spatula still in his hand, and looked down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. What if I want to? What if taking care of you and Grace is the best part of my day? Before Emily could respond, he leaned down and kissed her softly, a good morning greeting that tasted like coffee and promises. Even simple kisses like this one still made Emily's knees weak, still filled her with wonder that someone like Alexander had chosen someone like her. Besides, Alexander murmured against her lips, I have news that requires celebration pancakes. What kind of news? Emily asked, automatically reaching for plates to set the table. The kind where Marcus Wellington III will no longer be a problem for you or anyone else, Alexander said with obvious satisfaction. It seems his business practices have come under scrutiny from several regulatory agencies. Fascinating how these things happen when the right people ask the right questions. Emily paused in her plate arranging to stare at him. Alexander, what did you do? Nothing illegal, Alexander assured her, his expression innocently bland. I simply made some calls to colleagues who might be interested in Mr. Wellington's methods of approaching young women with what he calls business propositions. Turns out you weren't his first target. You got him investigated? I got him exposed, Alexander corrected. The investigation was already warranted based on his behavior. I just made sure the right people became aware of the pattern. Emily felt a surge of fierce gratitude and admiration. Alexander had kept his promise to protect her, but he'd done it in a way that protected other women too. It was exactly the kind of principled action she'd come to expect from him. Thank you, she said quietly, for keeping me safe, for making sure he can't hurt anyone else. Alexander set down the spatula and pulled Emily into his arms properly, his expression serious. Emily, I need you to understand something. Protecting you isn't a favor or a kindness. It's not something you need to thank me for. You're mine to protect now, and Grace is mine to protect. That's not a burden or an obligation, it's a privilege. The words "you're mine" sent heat spiraling through Emily's body, along with a sense of security she'd never experienced before. To belong to someone, to be claimed and cherished and protected, it was everything she'd never dared to hope for. I'm yours? She whispered, her hands fisting in his shirt. Completely, Alexander replied, his voice rough with emotion. And I'm yours, Emily. Completely and absolutely yours. Grace chose that moment to voice her opinion on being ignored, letting out an indignant squawk that made them both laugh and break apart. Demanding little princess, Alexander said fondly, moving to rescue the pancakes before they burned. She definitely gets that from your side of the family. Hey, Emily protested, but she was laughing as she settled into her chair. I am not demanding. Alexander raised an eyebrow as he served perfectly golden pancakes onto her plate. Last week, you made me go back to the store because I bought the wrong brand of baby formula. The week before that, you reorganized my entire approach to Grace's bedtime routine because my technique was too stimulating before sleep. That's not demanding, that's being thorough, Emily argued, cutting Grace's pancake into tiny pieces. And you admitted the new routine works better. I'm not complaining, Alexander said, his tone warm with affection. I like that you have opinions about everything. I like that you care enough to correct me when I'm doing something wrong. I've spent too many years surrounded by people who only tell me what they think I want to hear. Emily looked up from Grace's breakfast to find Alexander watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. Even now, after weeks of hearing him say things like this, she sometimes couldn't quite believe it was real. What? She asked softly. Just thinking about how different my life is now, Alexander replied. 3 months ago, breakfast was black coffee in my office, while I reviewed overnight market reports. Now it's pancakes with my girls, and Grace is explaining the finer points of syrup distribution. Your girls, Emily repeated, testing the phrase that made something warm and possessive unfurl in her chest. My girls, Alexander confirmed, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. If you'll have me. It wasn't quite a proposal, but it felt like one. Emily looked around the kitchen, at Grace happily destroying her breakfast, at Alexander still in his business suit, but with syrup on his tie and love in his eyes, at the life they'd somehow built together in this apartment that had started as charity and become a home. We'll have you, she said simply, and watched Alexander's entire face light up with joy. The peaceful morning was interrupted by Emily's phone ringing. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It was Mrs. Morrison from the bakery, and she never called this early unless there was a problem. I should take this, Emily said apologetically, stepping into the living room. Mrs. Morrison, is everything all right? Oh, honey, Mrs. Morrison's voice was thick with emotion. I'm so sorry to call you like this, but I have bad news. My daughter in Phoenix. She's had a heart attack. I need to go to her immediately, and I don't know when I'll be back. Emily's stomach dropped. Mrs. Morrison wasn't just her boss. She was the closest thing to a mother figure Emily had found since her own mother's death. "Oh my God, Mrs. Morrison, of course you need to go. Is she going to be okay?" "The doctors think so, but she'll need help with recovery, and her own children are still so young." Mrs. Morrison's voice cracked. "Emily, I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to have to close the bakery, at least temporarily. I can't ask you to try to run it on your own with Grace to care for, and I can't afford to hire a manager." Emily sank onto the sofa, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. No job meant no income. No income meant she couldn't pay utilities or groceries, couldn't contribute anything to the household expenses that allowed her to maintain her pride and sense of independence. "I understand," Emily managed, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "Family comes first. Don't worry about me, I'll figure something out." After hanging up, Emily sat staring at her phone, her mind racing through options that all seemed inadequate. She had some savings from the past few weeks of steady work, but not enough to last long, and finding another job that would allow her to bring Grace would be nearly impossible. "Emily!" Alexander's voice came from the kitchen doorway, concern evident in his tone. "What's wrong?" Emily looked up to find him watching her with the careful attention that meant he'd already catalogued her distress and was preparing to fix whatever had caused it. "Mrs. Morrison has to close the bakery," Emily explained, fighting to keep the despair out of her voice. "Her daughter's sick and she needs to go take care of her family. I don't know for how long." Alexander was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "What will you do?" "Look for another job, I guess. Though I don't know where I'll find one that lets me bring Grace." Emily laughed shakily. "Maybe I can do more catering jobs, build up a client base for baked goods. It might take a while to get established, but—" "Emily," Alexander's voice was gentle but firm, "you don't have to worry about this." Emily's back stiffened automatically. "Alexander, we've talked about this. I need to contribute. What if I told you I had an idea, something that would let you use your skills and build your own business, but in a way that makes financial sense for both of us?" Emily looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of idea?" Alexander moved to sit beside her on the sofa, his expression serious. "I own a small commercial building downtown that's been sitting mostly empty. Ground floor retail space, kitchen facilities already installed. What if we turned it into Emily's bakery?" Emily's heart leaped and sank simultaneously. "Alexander, I can't let you—" "Hear me out," Alexander interrupted, holding up a hand. "This would be a legitimate business partnership. You provide the talent and the recipes. I provide the initial capital and the space. We split profits after expenses, and you have complete creative control over the menu and operations." "That's not a partnership, that's charity with extra steps," Emily protested, though she couldn't deny the appeal of the idea. "It's an investment in someone whose lemon scones are better than anything I can buy at the most expensive bakeries in the city," Alexander countered. "Emily, you have real talent, exceptional talent. With the right setup and marketing, you could build something amazing." Emily was quiet for a moment, torn between the dream he was offering and her fierce need to maintain her independence. "What if it fails? What if I can't make it profitable?" "Then we try something else," Alexander said simply. "Emily, I believe in you. I believe in your talent and your work ethic and your ability to build something wonderful. But more than that, I want to give you something that's yours. Not charity, not a temporary solution, but something you own and control and can be proud of." Emily looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity and love and absolute confidence in her abilities. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of but never dared to hope for. "I'd want everything in writing," she said slowly. "Proper contracts, legal partnership agreements, everything official." Alexander nodded immediately. "Of course. My lawyers will draw up whatever documents you need. Completely legitimate business arrangement. And if things don't work out between us personally—" Emily forced herself to voice the fear that lurked beneath all her happiness. "The business partnership remains separate?" Alexander's expression softened with understanding. "Emily, no matter what happens between us, you'll always have that bakery. If you want it, it's yours. I give you my word." Emily believed him. Against all her carefully learned cynicism, against all her experience with disappointment and betrayal, she believed Alexander Blackwood completely. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." Alexander's face lit up with a joy so pure it took Emily's breath away. "Really?" Really? But I have conditions. Name them. I pay you back for the initial investment before we split any profits. And I want Grace to have a safe space in the bakery where she can play while I work. Done and done, Alexander agreed immediately. Anything else? Emily looked at this man who'd somehow taken all her dreams and made them possible, who'd seen past her circumstances to her potential, who loved her sister as much as he loved her. Just one more thing, she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. What's that? Kiss me, Emily whispered. Kiss me like we're about to start the rest of our lives. Alexander's answer was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with all the love and promise and hope for the future that lived in his heart. It was a kiss that tasted like new beginnings and shared dreams, like the sweetest thing they'd ever create together. From the kitchen, Grace's delighted laughter provided the perfect soundtrack to the moment when Emily Carter and Alexander Blackwood decided to build something beautiful together. Not just a business or a relationship, but a real family, messy and complicated, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties, but also full of possibility. And for the first time since her mother's death, Emily felt like she could handle anything life threw at them. After all, they had love, they had each other, and they had Grace's sticky handprints on everything they touched. What more could anyone possibly need? 6 weeks later, Emily stood in the middle of what would soon become Emily's Bakery, watching Alexander attempt to assemble a display case, while Grace helped by handing him random screws from her place on the floor. The sight was so ridiculous, this powerful CEO in his rolled-up shirt sleeves, consulting an instruction manual with the same intensity he'd probably give to a billion-dollar merger, while a one-year-old provided commentary in enthusiastic gibberish, that Emily had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. I think you're holding that piece upside down, Emily observed, wiping flour from her hands as she took a break from testing recipes in the newly installed commercial kitchen. Alexander looked up from the manual, his hair disheveled and a smudge of something unidentifiable on his cheek. According to Grace, I'm doing everything wrong. She's been quite vocal about her opinions on my construction skills. Dada no good, Grace announced with the authority of someone who clearly knew better, then clapped her hands at her own cleverness. Alexander feigned indignation. No good. I'll have you know I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School. Ah well, business school doesn't really prepare you for IKEA furniture, Emily said with mock seriousness. It's a completely different skill set. Are you both ganging up on me now? Alexander asked, but his eyes were warm with laughter and something deeper. Contentment, Emily realized. He looked happier and more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. Maybe a little, Emily admitted, settling cross-legged on the floor beside Grace. But only because you're adorable when you're frustrated. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Adorable? I'm supposed to be intimidating and commanding. You are, Emily assured him, reaching up to wipe the smudge from his cheek. But right now you're also covered in sawdust and taking construction advice from a baby. It's a very attractive look on you. The casual intimacy of the gesture, Emily cleaning his face like they'd been together for years instead of months, hit Alexander with a wave of emotion so strong it nearly knocked him sideways. This was what he'd never known he was missing, the easy domesticity, the gentle teasing, the sense of building something meaningful together. I love you, he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Emily's hand stilled against his cheek, her eyes widening at the unexpected declaration. They'd been saying it more freely lately, but it still took her breath away every time. I love you too, she whispered, leaning up to kiss him softly. Grace, clearly feeling left out of the attention, crawled over and pulled herself up on Alexander's leg with a demanding up. Alexander lifted her easily, settling her on his hip as she immediately began investigating the buttons on his shirt with the intense focus of a tiny scientist. What do you think, Princess? Should we let your sister keep making fun of my assembly skills, or should we stage a rebellion? Grace babbled something that sounded vaguely conspiratorial, making Emily laugh. I can't believe she's siding with you, traitor. She knows quality construction when she sees it, Alexander replied solemnly, then ruined the effect by pointing to the definitely still upside-down piece of the display case. Emily shook her head in fond exasperation and moved to help him sort out the actual instructions. Working together, They managed to assemble the case properly, Grace providing enthusiastic supervision from her portable high chair. "This is nice," Emily said as they stood back to admire their handiwork. "All of this, working together, planning for the future. It feels real," Alexander suggested when she trailed off. "Real," Emily agreed. "For the first time since Mom died, I feel like I'm building something instead of just surviving." Alexander moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as they both surveyed their progress. The bakery was taking shape beautifully, warm wood tones and soft lighting creating an atmosphere that was both elegant and welcoming. Emily had insisted on keeping it simple and inviting, a place where families would feel comfortable bringing children and where people could escape the rush of city life for a few minutes. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Emily admitted, leaning back against Alexander's chest. "It feels too good to be true." "What if it's not?" Alexander said quietly. "What if this is just how life is supposed to feel when you're with the right person?" Emily turned in his arms to face him, studying his expression. "Is that what you think? That we're right together?" "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that I've spent 37 years trying to build a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty inside. And I think that everything changed the night you asked me for leftovers." Emily felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet sincerity in his voice. "Alexander, I think," he continued, reaching up to cup her face in his hands, "that Grace saved both of us. You saved me from a life of going through the motions, and I got to help save you from a situation that never should have happened to someone so remarkable." "You make me sound heroic," Emily said with a shaky laugh. "I was just trying to feed my sister." "You were loving her," Alexander corrected. "Completely, selflessly, without reservation. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How extraordinary it is to watch someone love like that?" Emily's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. "Alexander, what are you saying?" Before he could answer, his phone rang with the harsh intrusion of the outside world. Alexander glanced at the screen and sighed, his assistant, probably with some crisis that required immediate attention. "I should take this," he said apologetically. "Helen only calls my personal line for genuine emergencies." Emily nodded, moving to check on Grace while Alexander stepped outside to take the call. Through the large front windows, she could see him pacing on the sidewalk, his expression growing progressively more serious as the conversation continued. When he came back inside, his face was tight with controlled anger. "What's wrong?" Emily asked immediately. "My father," Alexander said grimly. "He's back." Emily felt a chill run down her spine at the darkness in Alexander's voice. He'd mentioned his father in passing, a controlling man who'd shaped Alexander's childhood with impossible expectations and emotional coldness. But Emily had gotten the impression that contact between them was minimal. Back from where? Europe. He's been living there for the past 5 years, basically in exile after some business deals went sideways. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, the relaxed contentment of moments before completely gone. "Helen says he's been asking questions about me, about my recent lifestyle changes." Emily's stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he knows about you and Grace." Alexander's voice was carefully controlled, but Emily could see the tension in every line of his body. "The kind that suggest he doesn't approve." Grace, sensing the sudden shift in mood, began to fuss in her high chair. Emily lifted her automatically, holding her close as anxiety fluttered in her chest. "What does that mean for us?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked at Emily, holding Grace, at the beautiful life they'd been building together, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. "It means," he said grimly, "that my father is about to learn that I'm not the same man he tried to mold 30 years ago. Alexander, maybe we should—" "No." Alexander's voice was firm, final. "Emily, whatever he says, whatever he threatens or promises or demands, nothing changes between us. Do you understand me? Nothing." Emily searched his face, seeing determination and love and something that looked almost like fear. "What aren't you telling me?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed and moved to sit in one of the cafe chairs they'd arranged in the front of the bakery. "My father spent my entire childhood trying to turn me into his version of the perfect heir," Alexander said quietly. "Everything I did was evaluated for its potential impact on the family reputation, the business, the social standing. When I was 12, he sent me to boarding school because I was too attached to my nanny. When I was 16, he ended my friendship with my roommate because the boy's family wasn't appropriate for association. Emily's heart ached for the lonely child Alexander must have been. That's terrible. He never hit me, Alexander continued, his voice carefully neutral. Never raised his voice, he was much more sophisticated than that. Emotional manipulation, withdrawal of affection, threats to cut off financial support. Very effective techniques for controlling someone who desperately wanted approval. And now, Emily asked gently, now I'm an adult with my own money and my own company. But Emily, Alexander looked at her with eyes that held years of painful history. He's very good at finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them, very good at making people doubt themselves and their choices. Emily understood immediately. You're worried he'll go after me. I'm terrified he'll convince you that you're not good enough for me, Alexander admitted, because that's exactly what he'll try to do. He'll tell you that our relationship is inappropriate, that you're holding me back, that Grace is a burden I've foolishly taken on. He'll try to make you believe that the best thing you could do for me is disappear. Emily felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. And what if he's right? Emily, no. Alexander was on his feet immediately, moving to take her free hand in both of his. He's not right. He's never been right about what makes me happy or what I need in my life. You and Grace are the best things that have ever happened to me. But your reputation, your business relationships, mean nothing without you, Alexander interrupted fiercely. Emily, listen to me. I built that company to prove something to a man who was never going to be proud of me anyway. I accumulated wealth and success like armor against his disapproval, and it never worked. I was miserable. Emily looked down at Grace, who was playing with the necklace Emily wore, a simple silver chain Alexander had given her last week, not because it was expensive, but because he'd seen her admiring it in a shop window. What if I can't handle it? Emily whispered. What if he says things that make me doubt everything we've built? Alexander gently tilted her chin up until she was looking at him again. Then you remember this moment. You remember how it feels right now to be loved completely and unconditionally. You remember that Grace calls me Dada, and that you hum while you bake, and that we've built something beautiful together. Emily nodded, though she couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her chest like a cold weight. Emily, Alexander said softly, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me that if my father contacts you, when he contacts you, you'll tell me immediately. Don't try to handle him alone. Don't try to protect me from whatever he says. Promise me you'll come to me. Emily looked into his eyes, seeing love and determination and absolute commitment to their relationship. I promise. Alexander pulled her into his arms then, Grace sandwiched between them in a hug that felt like a vow, like a circle of protection against whatever storm was coming. We're going to be okay, he murmured against Emily's hair. Whatever he tries, whatever he says, we're strong enough to handle it together. Emily wanted to believe him. Holding Grace in their makeshift family embrace, surrounded by the evidence of the dreams they were building together, she almost could. But as they locked up the bakery that evening and headed home to the apartment that had become their sanctuary, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful happiness was about to be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Some storms, she was learning, gave you warning before they hit. Others arrived without notice, changing everything in their path. As they settled into their evening routine, Alexander reading to Grace while Emily prepared dinner, all of them moving around each other with the easy choreography of a real family, Emily held tight to every moment, every small joy, every piece of the life they'd built, because deep in her heart, she had the terrible feeling that they were going to need these memories to get through whatever was coming next. The confrontation Emily had been dreading came on a Tuesday morning, swift and devastating as a summer tornado. She was at the bakery, putting the finishing touches on a batch of raspberry tarts for the soft opening scheduled for the following week, when the front door chimed with the entrance of someone who definitely didn't belong in her warm, flower-scented sanctuary. Richard Blackwood Sr. was everything Emily had imagined and worse. Tall like his son but without any of Alexander's warmth, he carried himself with the kind of authority that came from decades of having people defer to his every whim. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his ice-grey eyes, so like Alexander's but utterly devoid of kindness, swept over the bakery with obvious disdain. Grace, who had been playing contentedly in her portable playpen near the kitchen, looked up at the stranger and immediately began to whimper. Even at 14 months old, she seemed to sense the threat this man represented. "Miss Carter, I presume," Richard said, his voice carrying the kind of cultured accent that spoke of expensive schools and exclusive social circles. "I'm Richard Blackwood. I believe you know my son." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Mr. Blackwood, Alexander isn't here right now, but I can call him if—" "That won't be necessary." Richard moved deeper into the bakery, his gaze cataloguing every detail with the precision of someone evaluating an investment. "I'm here to speak with you." Emily wiped her hands on her apron, stalling for time while her mind raced. Alexander had warned her this might happen, had made her promise to call him immediately, but something about Richard's presence, the way he filled the space with cold authority, the way Grace had started crying at the sight of him, made Emily want to handle this herself, to protect Alexander from whatever ugly scene his father had planned. "I'm listening," Emily said, lifting Grace from her playpen and settling the baby against her hip. The familiar weight was comforting, a reminder of what she was fighting for. Richard's eyes flicked to Grace with barely concealed distaste. "I see Alexander has become quite invested in your domestic situation." "Alexander cares about us, yes," Emily replied carefully, "if that's what you mean." "What I mean, Miss Carter, is that my son has allowed his emotions to override his judgment." Again. Richard's tone was conversational, almost pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "He's always been susceptible to rescue fantasies, even as a child. The wounded bird, the stray dog, the charity case that needs saving." Each word hit Emily like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Blackwood." "Aren't you?" Richard smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "A young woman with a child, no family, no resources, no education to speak of. Living in my son's apartment, working in a business he's funding, completely dependent on his continued affection." Emily felt heat creep up her neck, but forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Alexander and I are partners, in business and in life." "Partners." Richard repeated the word as if it tasted unpleasant. "How progressive. Tell me, Miss Carter, what exactly do you bring to this partnership? Besides the obvious physical attractions, of course." The crude implication made Emily's stomach turn, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "I bring my skills, my work ethic, and my love for your son." Love, another word that seemed to disgust him. How romantic. But love doesn't build empires, Miss Carter. Love doesn't maintain social standing or business relationships. Love is a luxury that men like Alexander can't afford. Grace had stopped crying but remained tense in Emily's arms, her little fingers fisting in Emily's shirt, as if she could sense the danger in this stranger's words. "Alexander seems to think he can afford it just fine," Emily said quietly. Richard's smile sharpened. "Alexander thinks many things. He thought he could defy me when he was 16 and wanted to pursue art instead of business. He thought he could refuse the marriage I'd arranged with the Pemberton girl. He thought he could build his company without my connections or influence." Emily's heart sank as the implications became clear. "You arranged his relationship with Victoria." "Attempted to, yes. A sensible match that would have benefited both families." Richard moved closer and Emily had to fight the urge to step back. "But Alexander has always been ridiculously sentimental about marriage. He insisted on some fairy tale notion of love." "Maybe because love is what makes life worth living," Emily said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Richard laughed, the sound genuinely amused but utterly without warmth. "How delightfully naive. Let me share some reality with you, Miss Carter. Alexander's company is successful, but it's not invulnerable. His clients are sophisticated people who expect a certain standard from their financial advisors. Do you really think they'll continue trusting their investments to a man whose judgment is so poor he's playing house with a former homeless woman and her illegitimate child?" Emily flinched as if he'd struck her. "Grace isn't illegitimate. She's my sister." "Ah yes, how noble. Playing mother to your dead parents' mistake." Richard's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction at having found a pressure point. "Tell me, How long do you think Alexander's clients will take your situation seriously? How long before his business partners start questioning his decision-making abilities? You don't know what you're talking about, Emily said, but her voice lacked conviction. Richard's words were finding their mark, awakening every insecurity she'd tried to bury since falling in love with Alexander. Don't I? I built that company's reputation, Miss Carter. I know exactly how fragile these things can be. One whisper campaign, one suggestion that Alexander's personal life has compromised his professional judgment, and clients will flee to more stable advisors. Emily's mouth went dry. You wouldn't destroy your own son's career. I wouldn't have to destroy it, Richard said smoothly. Just make it challenging, expensive, stressful. Amazing how quickly romance dies under financial pressure. Grace began to fuss again, picking up on Emily's distress. Emily bounced her gently, trying to project calm she didn't feel. What do you want? Emily asked quietly. I want you to think, Miss Carter. Really think about what's best for Alexander. Do you honestly believe you can make him happy long-term? Can you give him the kind of life he was born for? Can you move in his social circles, support his career, be the kind of wife his position requires? Each question was another blow to Emily's confidence. She thought of the charity galas Alexander attended, the business dinners with clients worth millions, the social expectations that came with his wealth and status. How could someone like her, someone who'd been asking for leftovers just months ago, possibly fit into that world? I love him, Emily whispered, the words feeling inadequate even as she said them. Love. Richard's tone was pitying now, which was somehow worse than his earlier cruelty. And when that love starts to feel like a burden, when he's passed over for promotions because his colleagues don't take him seriously anymore, when he realizes what he's sacrificed for a fantasy. Stop, Emily said, her voice cracking. Just stop. I'm trying to save you both from years of misery, Richard continued relentlessly. You seem like a decent girl, Emily. Surely you want what's best for Alexander, even if it's not what feels good in the moment. Grace began to cry in earnest now, her wails echoing through the bakery. Emily clutched her tighter, using the baby's distress to focus on something other than the terrible doubt Richard was sowing in her mind. He deserves someone who enhances his life rather than limiting it, Richard said, his voice almost gentle now. Someone who can be a true partner in every sense of the word. Emily closed her eyes, Richard's words mixing with her own deepest fears in a toxic cocktail of self-doubt. What if he was right? What if her love for Alexander was ultimately selfish, holding him back from the kind of life he deserved? I have a proposition for you, Richard continued. Leave, tonight. Take the child and disappear from Alexander's life before you do any more damage. Emily's eyes snapped open. I won't abandon him. Not abandon. Release him. Let him find someone appropriate, someone who can actually contribute to his success rather than jeopardizing it. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a bank check. This should be enough to start over somewhere new, enough to give your sister a good life without depending on my son's misguided charity. Emily stared at the check. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. Enough to secure Grace's future. Enough to never have to worry about basic survival again. All she had to do was walk away from the man she loved more than her own life. He'll hate you, Emily said quietly. Perhaps, but he'll recover and his life will be better for it. Can you say the same about what happens if you stay? Emily looked around the bakery. Their bakery. The dream they'd built together. She thought about Alexander's face when he talked about their future. The way Grace reached for him every morning. The life they'd carved out of impossible circumstances. Then she thought about the sophisticated clients who trusted Alexander with their fortunes, the business partners who might question his judgment, the career he'd worked so hard to build. What if Richard was right? What if her love was ultimately destructive? I need time to think, Emily whispered. Richard smiled, sensing victory. Of course, but don't take too long, Miss Carter. Every day you wait makes it harder on everyone involved. He set the check on the nearest table and headed for the door. Oh, and Miss Carter, I'd prefer if this conversation remained between us. Alexander doesn't need to know about my visit unless you decide to accept my offer. No point in causing unnecessary drama. After he left, Emily sank into one of the cafe chairs, Grace still crying in her arms. The bakery that had felt so warm and welcoming minutes before now felt cold and foreign, tainted by Richard's presence and ugly words. Emily looked at the check on the table. Enough to disappear, enough to give Grace everything she needed without dependence on anyone else. All she had to do was sacrifice her own happiness. The question was, if loving Alexander meant potentially destroying his career and limiting his future, was her happiness worth that cost? As Grace finally settled into hiccuping sobs, Emily held her sister close and tried to figure out how to choose between love and sacrifice, between her own heart and Alexander's best interests. Some choices, she was learning, didn't have right answers. Some choices only had consequences you had to live with for the rest of your life. And Emily had less than 24 hours to decide which consequences she could bear. Emily spent the night staring at the ceiling, Richard's check burning like an accusation on her nightstand. Grace slept fitfully in her crib, as if even in sleep she could sense the turmoil surrounding them. Every time Emily closed her eyes, she heard Richard's voice. Love is a luxury that men like Alexander can't afford. By dawn, Emily had made her decision. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder than losing her mother, harder than those desperate nights in the car with Grace crying from hunger. But love, real love, meant wanting what was best for the other person, even when it destroyed you. Emily packed their belongings with mechanical precision, each folded piece of clothing another step away from the life she'd foolishly allowed herself to believe could last. Grace watched from her high chair, sensing something wrong but unable to understand what was happening. "We're going on a trip, baby girl," Emily whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Just you and me, like old times." Grace babbled something that sounded like dada, and Emily's heart cracked a little more. How do you explain to a 14-month-old that the man she'd come to think of as her father was never coming back? How do you make that kind of loss understandable? Emily left Alexander's key on the kitchen table, along with a letter she'd written and rewritten a dozen times, never finding words adequate for what she was trying to say. In the end, she'd settled for something simple. "Alexander, your father was right about one thing. You deserve someone who can truly be your partner in every aspect of your life. I love you too much to be the reason you lose everything you've worked for. Please don't try to find us. This is what's best for everyone. Take care of yourself. Love always, Emily P.S. Grace says goodbye. She loves her dada." Emily had to stop writing there, her vision blurred by tears that threatened to turn into sobs. If she started crying now, she'd never stop, and Grace needed her to be strong. The cab ride to the bus station was torture. Every street they passed held memories. The diner where they'd first met Alexander, the park where he'd pushed Grace on the swings last weekend, the flower shop where he'd bought her daisies just because it was Tuesday. Emily pressed her face to the window and tried to memorize it all, knowing she'd never see any of it again. At the station, Emily bought tickets to Portland, far enough away that Alexander wouldn't easily find them, big enough that they could disappear into the anonymity of city life. She'd cashed Richard's check that morning, the money feeling like blood money but necessary for Grace's future. They were waiting for their bus when Emily heard the distinctive ring of Alexander's phone. Her heart leaped before she realized it was coming from another passenger nearby, but the sound triggered such a wave of longing that Emily had to excuse herself to the bathroom, where she finally allowed herself to cry. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Grace when she returned, the baby's concerned eyes tracking the tears on Emily's cheeks. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. But this is what love looks like sometimes. It looks like letting go." Meanwhile, across town, Alexander was having the worst morning of his professional life. 3 major clients had called emergency meetings, each one expressing concerns about his recent lifestyle choices and their potential impact on his professional judgment. By noon, he'd lost 2 accounts worth millions in managed assets, and a third was threatening to follow suit. "I don't understand," Alexander told his assistant Helen, as she brought him the paperwork to formalize the latest client defection. "Where is this coming from? My personal life has never interfered with my work." Helen shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. "Sir, there have been rumors circulating about your living situation, about the young woman and child you've been seen with." Alexander felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of rumors?" "Nothing specific, just questions about your judgment. Suggestions that you might not be thinking clearly about certain business decisions." Alexander stared at Helen, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. How long has this been going on? The calls started coming in yesterday afternoon, Helen admitted reluctantly. But sir, there's something else. Your father was here this morning. He said he'd spoken with you about coming by, but he wanted to leave something in your office. Alexander was on his feet immediately. He was in my office? Just for a few minutes. He said he'd left some family documents you needed to see. Alexander pushed past Helen into his private office, scanning for whatever his father had left behind. On his desk, in a manila envelope marked with his name, he found photocopied bank records, phone logs, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report on Emily. The documents painted a picture that made Alexander's blood run cold. Every detail of Emily's life before they met was laid out in clinical detail. Her mother's medical bills, the eviction notice from their old apartment, even photos of Emily and Grace sleeping in their car. But it was the narrative thread woven through the documents that made Alexander see red. A carefully constructed story suggesting that Emily had targeted him specifically, that their meeting at the diner had been planned, that she was an opportunist who'd manipulated his emotions for financial gain. Alexander's hands shook as he reached the final page, a note in his father's handwriting. I've taken the liberty of sharing these concerns with several of your key clients. They appreciate being made aware of potential security risks. The situation can still be salvaged if you act quickly. R.B. Alexander was halfway to his car before he finished reading, his heart hammering with fury and desperate fear. His father hadn't just attacked his business. He'd gone after Emily directly. And Emily, with her fierce pride and deep-seated belief that she wasn't good enough for him, would be devastated by whatever Richard had told her. The drive to Maple Heights had never seemed longer. Alexander took the stairs to the apartment 2 at a time, his key already in his hand as he reached the door. The silence that greeted him was wrong immediately. The apartment felt empty in a way it never had. Even before Emily and Grace had moved in, it felt abandoned. "Emily?" Alexander called out, though he already knew she wouldn't answer. "Grace?" He found the letter on the kitchen table, along with his spare key and the apartment key he'd had made for Emily. His hands shook as he read her words, each line feeling like a physical blow. "No," Alexander said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty apartment. "No, this is not what's best for everyone." He was already reaching for his phone, dialing Emily's number, even as he read the note again. The call went straight to voicemail, her gentle voice asking him to leave a message, a recording from their early days when she'd been shy about talking to him on the phone. "Emily, if you're listening to this, please call me back," Alexander said after the beep. "Whatever my father said to you, whatever lies he told you, none of it matters. I love you. I love Grace. Come home and we'll figure this out together." He tried calling 3 more times before accepting that Emily had turned off her phone. She was gone, and she didn't want to be found. Alexander sank into the kitchen chair where he'd shared countless meals with Emily and Grace, where Grace had thrown her first successful spoonful of applesauce, where Emily had told him she loved him for the first time. The silence was deafening. His phone rang, startling him out of his devastation. Helen's name appeared on the screen. "Sir? I have Mr. Blackwood Sr. on the line. He says it's urgent." "Put him through," Alexander said, his voice deadly calm. "Alexander," Richard's voice was smooth, satisfied. "I trust you've discovered my little gift by now." "If you've hurt her," Alexander began, but Richard cut him off. "Hurt her? I've saved her from years of heartbreak and social humiliation. You should be thanking me." "Where is she?" Alexander demanded. "Gone. As she should be." "Really, Alexander, you can't be surprised. Did you honestly think a girl like that could handle the pressure of your lifestyle? I simply helped her see reason." Alexander felt something cold and murderous unfurl in his chest. "What exactly did you say to her?" "The truth. That she was holding you back, damaging your reputation, limiting your potential. Amazing how quickly these charity cases fold when confronted with reality." Alexander closed his eyes, imagining Emily's face as his father systematically destroyed her confidence and self-worth. Emily, who already believed she didn't deserve happiness, who'd spent her whole life convinced she was a burden to everyone she loved. "You bastard," Alexander said quietly. "I'm a realist, and in 6 months, when your business has recovered and you've found someone appropriate, you'll thank me for this intervention." "No," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength with each word. In 6 months I'll be married to Emily Carter, if she'll still have me after the damage you've done. And you, father, will be out of my life permanently. Richard laughed. Alexander, be reasonable. The girl is gone. It's over. Accept reality and move on. The only thing that's over, Alexander replied, is any relationship between you and me. Don't contact me again. Don't come near Emily or Grace. And if I find out you've spread one more lie about the woman I love, I will destroy every business connection you have left. Alexander? Alexander hung up, already planning his next move. Emily might think she was protecting him by leaving, but she was wrong about everything. About her worth, about what he needed, about what was best for both of them. Now he just had to find her and convince her of that before pride and his father's poison convinced her she was better off without him. The hunt for Emily Carter was about to begin, and Alexander Blackwood had never been more motivated to win anything in his entire life. Because some things, some people, were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. And Emily and Grace were worth everything. Alexander had always been methodical in business, but hunting for Emily brought out a desperate efficiency he'd never experienced before. Within 2 hours of finding her letter, he'd hired 3 different private investigation firms, put alerts on both Emily's and Grace's social security numbers, and had people checking every bus station, train depot, and airport within a 100-mile radius. The first break came 6 hours later, security footage from the Greyhound station showing Emily boarding a bus to Portland with Grace. Alexander was on the next flight to Oregon, his phone constantly buzzing with updates from his investigators and increasingly frantic messages from Helen about the chaos he'd left behind at the office. He ignored them all. Right now, nothing mattered except finding Emily and convincing her to come home. Meanwhile, Emily sat in a cramped motel room in downtown Portland, staring at the local newspaper's job listings, while Grace napped fitfully on the narrow bed. The baby had been fussy and clingy since they'd arrived, clearly missing the routine and security of their life with Alexander. Every time Grace cried, Emily felt another piece of her heart crack. She'd found a temporary placement at a small bakery across town, minimum wage, no benefits, but they didn't mind her bringing Grace as long as the baby stayed quiet. It was exactly the kind of job she'd been working before Alexander entered their lives, the kind that would keep them alive, but never allow them to truly thrive. This is what's best, Emily whispered to herself for the 100th time since leaving. This is what love looks like. But even as she said the words, they felt hollow. If this was best for everyone, why did she feel like she was dying inside? Why did Grace keep looking toward the door as if expecting Alexander to walk through it? Emily's phone, which she'd kept turned off since leaving, buzzed with 17 new voicemail messages when she finally turned it on to check the time. All of them were from Alexander, his voice growing more desperate with each message. Emily, please call me back. Whatever my father said, we can work through it together. I don't care about the business, about the clients, about any of it. I care about you and Grace, that's all that matters. I love you. God, Emily, I love you so much. Please don't do this to us. The final message had been left just an hour ago. Emily, I'm in Portland. I know you're here somewhere and I'm not leaving without you. We need to talk, really talk, without my father's poison between us. Emily's hands shook as she deleted the messages without listening to them all. Hearing Alexander's voice, broken with emotion she'd caused, was too painful, but knowing he was in the same city, that he'd followed her across the country, filled her with a dangerous hope she couldn't afford. Grace woke from her nap, cranky and inconsolable, clearly overwhelmed by all the changes. Emily tried everything, formula, toys, songs, walking around the tiny room, but nothing worked. Grace kept saying "Dada" through her tears, the word like a knife in Emily's heart. He's not coming, baby girl, Emily whispered, her own tears finally starting to fall. Dada can't come. We have to be brave now, just the two of us. Grace's response was to cry harder, her little face red with distress and confusion. She didn't understand why they'd left their home, why the man who'd become her father figure had disappeared, why everything familiar was gone. Emily was trying to comfort Grace when someone knocked on the motel room door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She'd registered under a false name, paid cash, been so careful. How could anyone have found them? Emily, I know you're in there. Alexander's voice came through the thin door, and Emily's knees nearly buckled with relief and terror. "Please, just talk to me. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." Emily looked around the dingy motel room, at Grace still crying in her arms, at the life they'd been reduced to in just one day. Then she looked at the door that separated her from the man she loved more than her own life. "Go away, Alexander," Emily called out, though her voice lacked conviction. "No." Alexander's reply was immediate and firm. "I'm not going anywhere until you explain to me how destroying both our lives constitutes love." "I'm protecting your future," Emily said, loud enough to be heard through the door. "My future is with you and Grace," Alexander replied. "Everything else is just details." "Your father was right about—" "My father was wrong about everything," Alexander interrupted. "Emily, please let me in. Let me show you what he didn't want you to see." Despite every rational thought telling her not to, Emily found herself walking to the door. Her hand hesitated on the lock. Once she opened it, she wasn't sure she'd have the strength to send him away again. 5 minutes, she said finally, unlocking the door. Alexander stood in the hallway looking like he'd been through hell, his hair disheveled, his usually perfect clothes wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. But when he saw Emily and Grace, his entire face transformed with relief and love so profound it took Emily's breath away. "Oh, thank God," Alexander breathed, stepping into the room. "I was so afraid I wouldn't find you." Grace's crying stopped the moment she saw Alexander, her little arms reaching for him with desperate joy. "Dada, Dada!" Alexander took Grace from Emily's arms, and the baby immediately settled against his chest with a contented sigh that broke Emily's heart all over again. This was what she was taking away from Grace, the father who loved her unconditionally, the security she'd finally found. "She missed you," Emily said quietly, unable to meet Alexander's eyes. "We both missed you too," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Emily, look at me, please." When Emily finally raised her eyes to his, Alexander felt his heart clench at the pain he saw there. "What did he tell you?" Emily wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold in the overheated motel room. "The truth, that I'm holding you back, damaging your reputation, that you deserve someone who can actually be a partner instead of a burden." "Emily," he showed me articles, Alexander, about the kind of women who marry men in your position. Educated, sophisticated, from the right families. That's not me, and it never will be. Alexander adjusted Grace against his shoulder and pulled out his phone with his free hand. "I want to show you something. Something my father didn't want you to see." He pulled up a series of emails and handed Emily the phone. "These started coming in yesterday afternoon, after my father began his little campaign to destroy my business." Emily read the first email, then the second, her expression growing increasingly confused. They weren't complaints or cancellations. They were messages of support from clients and colleagues, expressing concern about rumors they'd heard and assuring Alexander of their continued trust in his judgment. "I don't understand," Emily said. "My father overplayed his hand," Alexander explained. "He underestimated how well respected I am in my field and how little most people care about gossip. The few clients I lost were ones I was probably better off without anyway, narrow-minded people whose values don't align with mine." Emily continued reading, her hands shaking as she processed message after message of support, business offers, even a few notes from people sharing their own stories of unconventional love that had enriched their lives. "But your reputation is stronger than ever," Alexander interrupted. "Emily, do you know what happened after my father spread his rumors? 3 new clients signed with me, specifically because they'd heard I was a man who values family over profit. A major investment firm offered me a partnership because they were impressed by my authentic values and real-world perspective." Emily stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You didn't hold me back," Alexander continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You made me better, more human, more grounded, more capable of connecting with people because I finally understood what really matters. But the society expectations are meaningless to me," Alexander said firmly. "Emily, I've spent my entire life trying to meet other people's expectations of who I should be, and I was miserable. Then you and Grace came into my life, and for the first time, I understood what happiness actually feels like." Emily felt tears threatening again. "Alexander, I'm scared. I'm terrified that I'll never be enough for your world, that I'll embarrass you or hold you back or... Hey, Alexander stepped closer, his free hand cupping Emily's face with infinite tenderness. Do you remember what you told me the night we first kissed? About being scared? Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. You said you were scared of falling in love with someone you couldn't have, Alexander said softly. But Emily, you do have me. Completely, absolutely, forever. The question is, do I have you? Emily looked up into Alexander's eyes, seeing love and hope and absolute commitment. Grace babbled softly against his shoulder, one tiny hand fisted in his shirt as if she never intended to let him go. I love you, Emily whispered. I love you so much it terrifies me. Good, Alexander said with a smile that lit up his entire face. Because I love you too, both of you, more than my career, more than my reputation, more than anything else in this world. Alexander shifted Grace to his hip and reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand. Emily Carter, I had planned to do this properly, with flowers and candlelight and a romantic setting, but standing here in this terrible motel room, after almost losing you to my father's lies, I realize that the setting doesn't matter. What matters is what I'm asking. Emily's breath caught as Alexander pulled out a small velvet box. Marry me, Alexander said simply. Not because it makes sense socially or financially or professionally. Marry me because you love me, and I love you, and Grace needs us both. Marry me because what we have is real and beautiful and worth fighting for. Alexander opened the box to reveal a ring that was absolutely perfect, not ostentatious or overwhelming, but elegant and timeless, with a diamond that caught the harsh motel lighting and turned it into something beautiful. Marry me because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life, Alexander continued. Because I want to teach Grace to ride a bike and walk her down the aisle someday and give her the kind of father she deserves. Because I want to build Emily's bakery into something amazing together and buy a house with a big yard and maybe have more babies who look like you. Emily was crying openly now, happiness and relief and overwhelming love making it impossible to speak. Marry me, Alexander said one final time, because a life without you and Grace isn't a life I want to live. Through her tears, Emily managed to whisper the word that changed everything. Yes. Alexander's whoop of joy startled Grace, who clapped her hands in delight as if she understood exactly what had just happened. As Alexander slipped the ring onto Emily's finger with shaking hands, Grace babbled something that sounded suspiciously like Mama Dada, making them both laugh through their tears. We're really doing this? Emily asked, staring at the ring that caught the light like a promise. We're really doing this, Alexander confirmed, pulling both his girls into his arms. And Emily? We're going home. To our apartment, our bakery, our life. No more running, no more doubts. Just us, building something beautiful together. As Alexander kissed her, soft and desperate and full of promises for the future, Emily finally allowed herself to believe that fairy tales could come true. They just looked different than you expected, started with leftovers instead of glass slippers, and featured real people with real problems finding real love in the most unlikely places. But the happy ending? That part was exactly like the stories, complete with true love's kiss and the promise of forever after. Some love stories, Emily realized as Grace giggled between them, were worth every challenge they brought. Some love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, even disapproving fathers and self-doubt, and the vast differences between their worlds. This was their love story, and Emily couldn't wait to live the rest of it. 6 months later, Emily stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the small chapel they'd chosen for their wedding, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. The dress was simple but elegant, ivory silk that flowed gracefully to her ankles, with delicate lace sleeves that Alexander had specifically requested, because he loved how her hands looked in lace. "How you look like a princess," Grace announced from her perch on the window seat, wearing a miniature version of Emily's dress and a flower crown that kept sliding over one eye. "You look like an angel yourself, baby girl," Emily replied, adjusting Grace's crown with gentle fingers. At 20 months old, Grace was walking confidently now, chattering constantly, and had developed an adorable habit of calling Emily Mama and Alexander Dada with equal enthusiasm. Mrs. Morrison, who had flown in from Phoenix specifically for the wedding, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Your mother would be so proud," she said softly. "You've built something beautiful, honey." Emily touched the pendant at her throat, her mother's small pearl necklace, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept from their old life. "I hope so. I think she would have loved Alexander." "Are you kidding? A man who sends you flowers just because it's Tuesday and builds you your own bakery. She'd have adopted him immediately." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of changes, all of them wonderful. Emily's bakery had opened to incredible success, with lines around the block for Emily's signature lemon scones and raspberry tarts. Alexander had been her biggest supporter and most enthusiastic taste tester, though he'd had to start working out more to compensate for all the quality control he insisted was necessary. They'd moved into a beautiful house in a family-friendly neighborhood, with a big yard where Grace could play and a kitchen that was Emily's dream come true. Alexander had proposed officially 3 more times in increasingly elaborate ways, once with skywriting, once with a flash mob at the bakery, and once by having Grace deliver the ring in her tiny hands during breakfast. Emily had said yes every single time. Richard Blackwood Sr. had made one final attempt to interfere, showing up at the bakery with legal papers claiming Alexander wasn't competent to manage his own affairs. Alexander's response had been swift and decisive. A restraining order, a complete cut-off of all family financial ties, and a public statement that he was proud to choose love over legacy. They hadn't heard from Richard since. "5 minutes," called James, who had somehow been recruited as the unofficial wedding coordinator, despite his official role as their building's doorman. Alexander had wanted their real family involved in the ceremony, the people who had supported their love story from the beginning. Emily took a deep breath, smoothing her dress one final time. "Ready, Gracie? Ready to go make Dada officially part of our family?" Grace clapped her hands enthusiastically. "Dada, Mama, wedding!" The small chapel was perfect, intimate and warm, filled with the people who mattered most. Alexander's business partners and employees, the neighbors from their building, Mrs. Morrison's extended family who had embraced Emily and Grace as their own, even the cook from the diner where they'd first met, who'd insisted on catering the reception despite Emily's protests. But Emily only had eyes for Alexander as she walked down the short aisle with Grace's tiny hand in hers. He stood at the altar in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he watched his girls approach. When the officiant asked who was giving Emily away, Grace piped up loudly with, "Me!" sending ripples of laughter through the small congregation, and making Alexander grin so widely, Emily thought her heart might burst with happiness. The ceremony itself was a blur of vows and rings and promises for the future. But Emily would remember forever the way Alexander's voice shook as he said, "I do," the way Grace clapped when they kissed, the way the entire chapel erupted in cheers when they were pronounced husband and wife. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officiant announced with obvious delight, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Blackwood and their daughter Grace." Their daughter. Not Alexander's stepdaughter or Emily's sister, but their daughter, legally and officially as of that morning when the adoption papers had been finalized. Grace Blackwood, with 2 parents who loved her unconditionally and a future bright with possibility. The reception was everything Emily had dreamed of, dancing and laughter and cake that she'd made herself, because she couldn't trust anyone else to get the flavor exactly right. Alexander had surprised her by learning to waltz for their first dance, and Emily had surprised him by choosing their song, "At Last," by Etta James, because that's exactly how their love felt, like something she'd been waiting for her entire life without knowing it. "No regrets?" Alexander asked as they swayed together, Emily's head resting against his shoulder. "Only one," Emily replied, and felt Alexander tense slightly. "That we waited so long to get here." Alexander's laugh was warm against her ear. "We got here exactly when we were supposed to. Not a moment before, not a moment after." As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Emily found herself standing in the chapel's garden with Grace sleeping in her arms, watching Alexander say goodbye to the last few lingerers. Mrs. Morrison appeared beside her, following her gaze. "He's a good man," the older woman observed. "The way he looks at you both, like you're his whole world." "We are," Emily said softly, "just like he's ours." "Your mother would be so happy," Mrs. Morrison repeated, squeezing Emily's free hand. She always said you had enough love in your heart for a whole family. Looks like you finally found the family big enough to hold it all. Later, after they'd tucked a very tired Grace into her new princess bed in their hotel suite, Emily and Alexander finally had a moment alone as husband and wife. Emily stood at the window overlooking the city, still wearing her wedding dress, watching the lights twinkle below. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Everything," Emily replied, leaning back against his chest. "How we got here, how much has changed, how grateful I am." Alexander's hands splayed protectively over her stomach, and Emily covered them with her own. They hadn't told anyone yet, hadn't even confirmed it themselves, but Emily suspected their family was about to grow again. The timing was perfect. Grace was old enough to be a big sister, the bakery was established and successful, and they were ready for the next chapter of their life together. "Alexander," Emily said softly. "Thank you." "For what?" Emily turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "For seeing me, really seeing me, not just the circumstances or the problems. For loving Grace like she was your own from the very beginning. For building a life with us, instead of just helping us survive." Alexander caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Emily, you've got it backwards. You saved me, remember? From a life that looked successful on the outside but was empty inside. You taught me what love actually feels like, what family means, what's worth fighting for." "We saved each other," Emily corrected, and Alexander nodded in agreement. "We did. And now..." Alexander's smile turned tender and slightly nervous. "Now we get to save each other every day for the rest of our lives." "Is that what marriage is?" Emily asked with a smile. "Daily salvation?" "Among other things," Alexander replied, his voice taking on a different quality that made Emily's pulse quicken. "Would you like me to show you what else it includes?" Emily's breath caught as Alexander's hands began to work at the tiny buttons running down the back of her dress. "Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured against her neck, "I've been thinking about this moment for months." "Only months?" Emily teased, though her voice was already breathless. "Years," Alexander corrected, his lips tracing the line of her shoulder as her dress began to slip. "Since the moment you asked me for leftovers and turned my whole world upside down." What followed was everything Emily had dreamed of and more, tender and passionate, sweet and intense, full of whispered promises and overwhelming love. Alexander worshipped her body with the same reverence he'd shown her heart, making her feel beautiful and cherished and completely his. When they finally lay entwined in the soft hotel sheets, Emily's head on Alexander's chest and his fingers combing gently through her hair, Emily felt a peace she'd never experienced before. "I love you, husband," she whispered against his skin. "I love you too, wife," Alexander replied, the words warm with wonder and satisfaction. "For always and forever." "Forever," Emily agreed, already half asleep in the safety of Alexander's arms. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of their house, casting golden light across the scene of beautiful domestic chaos. Emily, 6 months pregnant and glowing with health, stood at the stove flipping pancakes while Grace, now 3.5, sat at the table carefully drawing pictures for the baby's nursery. "Mama, look!" Grace held up her latest creation, a stick-figure family with Mama, Dada, Grace, and Baby, written in crooked letters underneath. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Emily said, turning to admire the artwork just as Alexander walked into the kitchen, still in his pajamas, with his hair sticking up adorably. "Good morning, my beautiful girls," Alexander said, dropping a kiss on Grace's head before moving to Emily. His hands went immediately to her rounded belly, and the baby kicked in response to his touch. "Someone's active this morning," Alexander murmured, nuzzling Emily's neck. "Just like their daddy," Emily replied with a smile, "always ready for action." "Dada, the baby kicked me," Grace announced, pressing her small hand against Emily's stomach. "Did they? They must be excited to meet their big sister," Alexander said, crouching down to Grace's eye level. "Are you ready to help take care of the baby?" "Yes," Grace nodded enthusiastically. "I'm going to teach them about cookies and flowers and how to be good." Alexander and Emily exchanged a look of pure joy over Grace's head. Their daughter had grown into a confident, happy child who had no memory of their difficult early days. To Grace, Alexander had always been Dada, Emily had always been Mama, and their family had always been safe and loving and whole. "Speaking of the bakery," Emily said as they settled in for breakfast, "Mrs. Rodriguez called yesterday. She wants to place an order for her granddaughter's quinceañera, 3 dozen cupcakes and a custom cake." "Business is good?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. Emily's bakery had expanded twice in the past 2 years and now employed 6 people full-time. "Better than good. I'm thinking about that cookbook deal the publisher offered." Emily paused, suddenly uncertain. "But with the baby coming—" "We'll figure it out," Alexander assured her. The same words he'd been saying for 3 years now whenever Emily worried about balancing everything. "We always do." And they always had. When Emily's morning sickness had been severe during her first trimester, Alexander had stepped in to help run the bakery. When Alexander had been offered a promotion that would require extensive travel, he'd turned it down without hesitation, choosing family over career advancement. When Grace had gone through a difficult phase of separation anxiety, they'd rearranged both their schedules to ensure one of them was always available. "Mama, tell the story," Grace said suddenly, as she did at least once a week. "What story, baby girl?" "About how you and Dada fell in love," Grace replied, as if it should be obvious. Emily glanced at Alexander, who grinned and nodded encouragingly. Grace never tired of hearing about their meeting at the diner, though they'd edited the story significantly for a 3-year-old audience. "Well," Emily began, settling back in her chair with her hands resting on her belly, "once upon a time Mama was very sad and worried because she didn't have enough food for baby Grace." As Emily told the familiar story, about the kind man who shared his dinner, about the beautiful apartment where they learned to be a family, about the bakery where Mama made delicious treats, Alexander watched his wife and daughter with a heart so full of love it almost hurt. The story had changed over time, becoming more fairy tale than reality, but the essential truth remained. Sometimes love came when you least expected it, sometimes families were built from the most unlikely circumstances, and sometimes the best things in life started with a simple question asked in desperation and answered with kindness. "And then what happened?" Grace asked, even though she knew the ending by heart. "And then they all lived happily ever after," Emily finished, leaning over to kiss Grace's forehead. "With cookies," Grace added seriously. "With lots and lots of cookies," Alexander confirmed, making Grace giggle. As they finished breakfast and prepared for another busy day, Alexander to the office, Grace to her preschool, Emily to the bakery, Emily marveled at how ordinary their happiness had become. No drama, no crises, just the simple joy of loving and being loved in return. "Hey," Alexander said softly as they cleared the breakfast dishes together, Grace playing nearby with her toys. "Hey yourself," Emily replied, bumping his hip with hers. "Thank you," he said, just as he had on their wedding night. "For what?" "For asking me for leftovers that night, for giving me a reason to believe in love, for Grace, for this." He gestured around their sunny kitchen. "For everything." Emily stood on her tiptoes to kiss him softly, tasting forever in the simple press of lips that had become as natural as breathing. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for saying yes, for seeing a family where I only saw problems, for loving us exactly as we were and helping us become who we were meant to be." From the living room, Grace called out, "Mama, Dada, come see." They found her arranging her stuffed animals in an elaborate tea party setup, complete with tiny plastic cups and a toy cake. "It's a wedding," Grace announced proudly. "Bear is marrying Bunny and Elephant is the baby." Alexander and Emily settled on the floor beside their daughter, helping her orchestrate the stuffed animal ceremony while their own baby kicked contentedly in Emily's womb. And as Grace solemnly declared Bear and Bunny married forever and ever, Emily thought about how love really did multiply rather than divide, how a heart that had room for one person could somehow expand to encompass a whole family. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. But inside their home, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning, Emily and Alexander Blackwood were living proof that sometimes fairy tales did come true. They just started with leftovers instead of glass slippers, and they were more beautiful for being real. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.